What is up, my cutouts? Cardboard Ninja here, coming at you with one of the most exhaustive tier lists in Crossout, the long-awaited weapons tier list. A lot of people have been asking me to do this without them knowing just how many weapons are in Crossout. You guys can't see this because this will scroll down, but there are quite a few guns in Crossout, well over the 127. I said before, I think it's 131. This is going to take a while. Even if I were to speak only for 1 minute on each of these items, this video is going to be over an hour and a half long, so I apologize for that. So let's get into this as rapidly as possible. First and foremost, let me give a shout out to a guy by the name of Oots Darva, a guy who knows nothing about me and will never see this video, and is actually the inspiration for me even doing this video. Long story short, he plays a little game called Dead by Daylight, and he spent like 4.5 hours to like 12.5 hours explaining every single perk in the game. I wouldn't even bother even considering doing this if it weren't for the fact that that man spent far more time on a game that most people probably didn't even watch. Other than that, let's get to defining the tiers. D tier for weapons. These are weapons you're going to want to avoid. They're the bottom of the bottom. They're genuinely ass. You don't want to use them. They're good at usually about one thing, and the one thing that they're good at isn't gonna cut it. They underperform. You're gonna want to skip them. C tier. C tier weapons change how you play your build, but again, not how other people play against you. They are niche weapons that do only one thing, similar to D tier, but instead of D tier being completely useless, you can actually push them to be somewhat effective. So the problem is they're usually not the best at what they do, and they usually aren't the most effective weapon in any power score they're brought to. B tier weapons. A lot of weapons should be in B tier because that's the most balanced tier. These are weapons that are effective, but only at a limited power score range, so they don't go up or down too much from the power scores that they're good at. But if you do bring them out of those power score ranges, they tend to struggle. You're not going to see them do enough damage to your opponent, yada, yada, yada. They're solid weapons, they're fun weapons, but they operate within power score bands. A tier weapons are above the rest weapons. They outperform other weapons at the same job that you'll find in C or B tier. In addition to that, they usually can be brought in nearly any power score. They function in a lot of separate power scores. They do extraordinarily well, and they're nearly always viable. They even, most of the time, will end up working in CW and obviously raids. And of course, you know what the S tier weapons are. S tier weapons are the true threat weapons, the ones that are dragged down from the highest of power scores to as low as you can get them. Try and use them as seal clubs. It's your typical bully weapons. They fit in literally every power score that you can even fit them to, and they're difficult, if not impossible, to counter when encountered head to head. All right. With that said, let's get some examples on the board. Kicking things off, we start at the very dead bottom of D tier, potentially the worst weapon in the game, Clarinet Tow. Clarinet Tow is a very interesting missile launcher. It's an old one in Crossout, to be sure. It has an interesting perk/property. The overall idea behind the Clarinet Tow is that you fire it and you pilot it manually to your target. This weapon is one of the few weapons in the entire game, if not the only true weapon in the entire game, that has a unique property that says only one of these may ever be mounted on your vehicle at a time. This means that it is impossible to alpha strike with this. It is impossible to boat this weapon. At most, you will have a single one of these, and when you fire it, you are entirely vulnerable. You cannot activate cloaks, you cannot activate shields, you cannot move, you cannot drive your vehicle. You are completely helpless while you pilot this missile around. In reality, this weapon bullies low power score and low power score only. And when I say low, I mean low. 2K, 2.5K power score. You basically use this, a truck, and an ammo crate, and you stay at the edge of the map and you launch at noobs. It is an unfortunate weapon. No one uses it at any power score beyond the dead bare minimum, and even when used in that power score, you can be easily run down by any new player who simply W keys at you, and more appropriately, you shouldn't be using it at all, as it gives players a bad player experience. It is probably the worst weapon in Crossout. Moving on to the, I'd say the bottom of C tier, we've got the Phoenix. I'm going to eat a lot of crap for this. A lot of people are going to say, wait a minute, Cardboard Ninja, the Phoenix is a great gun. No, it's not. The Phoenix is another weapon that doesn't really have a perk, but its perk claims that it affixes its shot to your opponent, and after a few seconds it detonates. The Phoenix has a decent blast radius and actually decent damage, and there are a lot of people who like this gun a lot. However, this gun will change your playstyle more than anything else. You have to be exceptionally good. The projectile is exceptionally slow. It has a fairly bad projectile velocity, and which means it has a very large bullet drop. This can allow you to drop shots onto people, but that explosive device that gets affixed to someone's vehicle can be shot off. So it means that if you land your shot gun height at your opponents, it's very possible that them simply returning fire against you will remove it. If it lands anywhere within the radius that their guns can see on their own vehicle, they can remove it. And if you have one person, just one person on the opposing team with any hit scan weapon who's actually seeing you use these and decides to play as a teammate for once, which will never happen in Crossout, and they just shoot those off of allies, you will never do any damage. You can be the best player in the entire world with the Phoenix and do no damage. It's actually quite unfortunate. The reason why this doesn't rank D tier is because at C tier there are things you can do to make the Phoenix function. This is aiming for the waterline of your opponents. You should almost never aim high with the Phoenix. You want to land your shots really, really low. The reason for this is guns typically on the vehicle that you're aiming at can't aim directly down. So if you land your shots at the height of frame height or lower, then that means that it's very likely that your shots will actually get off and you can actually deal some damage. But other than that, this weapon will change the way you play more than your opponents, and actually it's one of the few weapons that allows for significant counterplay to it. So not very good. Moving on to my favorite weapon, or one of my favorite weapons, if not my signature weapon in Crossout, the Caucus. That goes directly into the middle of B tier. Most balanced weapon in the game. I consider the Caucus a gatekeeper weapon. Once again, another weapon that doesn't necessarily have a perk. The Caucus basically functions like a turret. You get to look at your opponent and you get a little lock-on icon. You hold down left mouse button or whatever your weapon's button is that you applied to the Caucus, and as long as you have a line of sight from your cabin to their cabin, you will then lock on and the Caucus will fire like a turret. This is a gatekeeper weapon because of the fact that there is a thing called seal clubbing, which is where people take significantly powerful weapons and drag them into lower power scores, and they intend to beat people to death with their overpowered guns. The problem with this is in order to do that, you have to sacrifice something, and they always sacrifice hit points in order to achieve this, which means that they usually don't have any armor. They usually use their guns as armor, but guns can only protect your cabin from fixed arcs. The Caucus is exceptionally brutal against seal clipping builds because you simply just drive around them and shoot. The Caucus only targets the cabin, and because they will have almost no cabin HP because all of their durability will be in their guns, you'll be able to score easy kills from seal clubbers, which is the reason why most seal clubbers absolutely hate people who use the Caucus, because it super mega hard counters them. However, the Caucus is interesting and only in the middle of B tier because while it can beat people who use super powerful weapons, anyone of appropriate equipment at the level of the Caucus either goes even, meaning to say it's a fair fight, or the Caucus actually comes out behind. Because you can only aim at the cabin, you can't pick off their guns. If they're using a decent amount of hit points and decent guns, they can either strip your guns or they can destroy you in just as much time. That makes this a pretty good B tier weapon. Considering continuing on from there, we have the Incinerator at A tier. Incinerator is the first heating weapon on the list. It fires massive puddles of fire. It actually shows you the parabolic arc right before you fire. Players that are exceptionally good with the Incinerator can do some insane damage. The reason why that they can do insane damage is because of the fact that if they can get you stuck in a cap can or have you ramming one of their teammates or whatever, and you start burning, you will be very dead very quickly. The Incinerator is one of a few weapons in the game with true AoE properties, which means that it will actually hit every single part, frame, wheels, every single part, generator included, all inclusive, at the same time. Even though the damage is low, most parts don't have that many hit points, surprisingly enough. The thing that keeps builds together is the fact that only a couple parts take damage at a time, whereas the Incinerator will deal all the damage all at once. In addition to that, being in the fire puddle for even half a second will maximally heat a build, meaning that it will take 200% damage. I'm sorry, it'll take 100% bonus damage or 200% damage from all opponents. And of course, if anybody's using an energy cabin, they will do increased damage over that. The Incinerator is a phenomenal weapon useful in raids, including Steel Cradle, to destroy the Leviathan, and is also very useful in Leviathan Clan Wars if you're very good, and very useful when you're farming the Invasion Leviathans as well, as this thing, as a true AoE weapon, can destroy any Leviathan in about 3 shots. Pretty crazy stuff. Moving on to what I would argue to be the best weapon in the entire game, the tippity top of S tier, the Porcupine. The #1 bully weapon of the game. It is remarkably imbalanced when it is used appropriately. You can shove this on a hover with a flash and you can destroy other hovers. You can throw this on 2 wheels and a dream and just destroy low power score. The Porcupine is the second weapon on this list that actually that has true AoE of the fire component, not the blast component. It does boatloads of damage. The Porcupines that it rolls out on the battlefield last an extraordinarily long time. They can be bounced off of things. They follow inertia of your build, so it actually can be somewhat difficult to aim. But other than that, the Porcupine is an unbelievably brutal weapon, especially seeing as it only takes 3 energy to use, so you can have a significant sum of Porcupines on your build. There are counters to the Porcupine, but In reality, the fact that you're attempting to counter the porcupine in the first place should let you know just about where you're at. It's an extraordinarily powerful weapon, probably the best one in the entire game, in my opinion. Next up on our list is the Firebug. We're going to put the Firebug at B tier, and even though the Firebug is an exceptionally powerful flame weapon, the problem is that it struggles outside of high power scores, which is where it is designed to fight. Bringing it down is really, really difficult, and it doesn't really transcend its own power score bracket very well, simply because of the fact its geometry isn't large enough to protect a cabin very well. And then in addition to that, Firebugs are a close-in weapon. You have to be very, very close, and that actually means that you're going to expose yourself to a significant more amount of weapons fire than you would normally want to be exposed to as a dog. So, and a dog is more or less the only way that you can run the Firebug. So that brings it out of A tier, but it's still a phenomenal weapon. Other than that, when compared to other flame weapons, it has 25% slower projectile velocity, giving it even less range, and you have to fire at even more of an arc. This is a very big problem for the Firebug. It is a good gun otherwise, and it is solid, and you will find it in CW, but unfortunately, because of the fact that its properties lend it to be a close-in fighter, that means that it's going to struggle when taken outside of a very high power score. Next up, we have the DT Python, which is a C-tier weapon at best. Most drone turrets, well, all function the exact same way. You drop them on the ground, they are placed, they then get a weapon lock on an opponent, and they fire. DT Python is no different. It has no specific perk beyond that. It fires bullets. They do like 13 damage a shot. They can be dangerous in some circumstance, but drones in Crossout as well as turrets aren't exceptionally good. They don't lend themselves towards an active playstyle necessarily. So other than that, they're just not very good. They're not very strong. They will get in the way of your allies, so people don't like when players play turrets because of the idea that you can be running in, you lay down some turrets, and all of a sudden your allies are now stuck on them, getting killed by your own guns because of the fact that they can't unaffix themselves from them. Not a very good weapon, but it doesn't make it into D tier because there are things that are slightly worse. Next up, we have the Thunderbolt shotgun. Originally, I would have put this at S tier if it weren't for the fact that they nerfed it specifically to bring it down out of S tier. So after the most recent nerfs, its DPS actually comes down. If you were to look at the shotguns, automatic shotguns, as a continuum, it actually has slightly less DPS than the maces before it, but the maces, of course, will take a little bit more energy to achieve that. Other than that, though, Thunderbolt is a solid gun. It still has a 4-pin base, making it mountable on nearly any place that you could put the previous guns, though its barrels overhang a little bit more, making it a little more awkward to place. It has phenomenal mass to its durability. So with that, you can put it on just about anything. The shotgun playstyle is exceptionally strong, and here is no different. A phenomenal, phenomenal gun that will work for a very, very long time for you. Next up is the Sledgehammer. That is also going at A tier right next to the Thunderbolt. Due to its power score, its size, like the Thunderbolt, it also is 4 pins, but its barrel doesn't overhang as much. These things are exceptionally hideable on your build. They're exceptionally strong. They are exceptionally good. Same gameplay style as the Thunderbolt, where you simply W key at someone and hold down LMB. This is the most basic gameplay style in Crossout, and there's a reason for it, because it is highly effective. Sledgehammer will punish a lot of people at low power score. The Thunderbolt will continue to punish people at higher power score. Next up is the Hammerfall, also at A tier. You're going to notice a pattern here. Hammerfall is larger than Thunderbolt, and is the first shotgun on the list going up in rarity from the Lupara that is using a different model. This is a very kind of a problematic model because the Hammerfall is actually more exposed than the Thunderbolt or the Sledgehammer, which would be bad and would knock it down a tier if it weren't for the fact that you can run your full build is only 2 Hammerfalls, meaning that they're cheaper to get a hold of, they're easier to get a hold of, their perk is great, especially when mounted onto a Leviathan for Leviathan Clan Wars, as it can jam the opponent's Leviathan's tracking, and that can actually end up winning you games. Crazy stuff. The durability is good. The DPS is actually higher than that of the Thunderbolt. 2 Hammerfalls will out DPS 3 Thunderbolts when stationary, not including the Thunderbolt's perk. It is, in general, a good gun. Even though it does get outclassed by a couple of other weapons, it is not a bad one by any means. Next up is the Spitfire, which is an S tier gun. I really, really hate to do this, but the Spitfire really does make it into S tier. And the only reason why is this poor gun has received so many nerfs from the devs because of the fact that it's just so hyper mega effective in its power scores that it's brought to. Any power score this thing is brought to effectively, it's going to shred. If you can effectively get to the power score using nothing but Spitfires, it's going to perform there. And it's going to perform very well. This is due to its hitbox being front-facing shotgun. This allows you to do a wide array of things, such as protect the shotguns almost entirely with even other Spitfires. You can undermount them with leeches. You can like do all forms of things where half of the gun is covered by frame or other structural parts. That makes the guns exceptionally difficult to strip. They're exceptionally good because they're full auto. It doesn't take very much skill to W key at your opponent, and the Spitfire is the epitome of said class of weapons. Next up is the AC-80 Stillwind. This is a weapon that recently received a buff, and it needed to receive a buff very, very badly. And the reason why was because, in general, autocannons are bad. At least this type of autocannon. If you can get your hands on a Stillwind, within, I mean, you need to get your hands on 3 of them, you can do somewhat well. Let's get this out of the way. Right now, at the time of making this tier list, the AC-80 Stillwind is the most expensive legendary weapon in the game. This is not because the Stillwind is good. It is because the Stillwind is rare. When the Stillwind came out, just to be clear, everyone thought it was ass. They looked at it, they tested it, a couple people made it, and they're like, this is some ass, and they didn't build it. They simply didn't make it. They're like, there will never be a market demand for this. Recently, there was a buff to the Stillwind decreasing its damage, which is good because it definitely needed it. But the problem with this is there are no AC-80 Stillwinds in the market because nobody made them, and therefore it is rare. Other than that, you really kind of have to try to keep your distance with the Stillwind. You don't really want to get people close to you. It's got a very poor turret traverse speed. It doesn't work very well with the Oppressor because of the fact that you'd have to end up getting to good speeds to using it. It's got terrible impulse, and so on and so forth, meaning that impulse to you, it's going to cause your build to be tipped over if you're not too careful. So with all those things in mind, it's going to be barely B tier. It is worth having, but barely B tier. Next up, we have the Thresher, which is the precursor to the Retcher, though not really. Just so we're clear, the Retcher is a quad-barreled grenade launcher, basically the shotgun grenade launcher, where the Thresher fire is basically a machine gun grenade launcher. Well, what can go wrong with that? The Thresher actually does have a perk, which would be that the further away your opponent is, not the more damage you deal, but if you land consecutive shots at distance, the damage of your grenades increases. That's all right. The Thresher has a phenomenal hitbox, actually. Probably too good, which allows you to hide the Thresher in builds in places that you should not be able to, which is actually pretty dang good. The only problem is that even though the Thresher is good, getting one means that you're not getting any closer to its the evolved form of the Retcher, because the Thresher isn't part of the Retcher's craftable components. That's not one of the things, because of the fact that the Thresher actually came out after the Retcher. So because of that, you're actually going to have to go out on a limb to pick up a Thresher, or even to get fused Threshers, and those are on the side. So with that said, the Thresher does struggle to perform in a lot of the power scores that it's brought to. It doesn't have the oomph of what you would expect because of the fact that it has to deal its damage over time and not immediately. And so with that, I gotta say that Thresher is probably more close to B tier than A tier. Next up, we have the Summiter. It is a special weapon that you have to overcharge to shoot. It actually does some oppressive damage at the power scores it's brought to. It's basically a shotgun or a machine gun if you choose to tap fire it, or so I have been told. I do have them. But the problem is that you do have to lead your shots. They are not hit scan like true shotguns. They also have no impulse at all. Damage from the Scimitar does not push your opponent in any way, shape, or form. The damage is actually quite decent, and for those of us who are unfamiliar, Scimitar doesn't actually have a perk, but one of the things you can do is you want to overcharge the Scimitar, not overcharge, you want to charge it halfway and fire. As if you charge up to halfway and fire, you will actually do the greatest amount of DPS and damage to your opponent. These things can be really annoying when played against, especially if you come across Scimitar bots, because they don't miss. But as a player, you're going to have to do a lot of calculations to land those shots on moving targets. And when they get to point blank range, if they're using true shotguns, this is going to struggle hard. C tier. Next up, we have the M32 Vindicator, front-facing machine gun extraordinaire, used in CW and in all other places. This is a very, 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 very strong machine gun. It is a shotgun machine gun that is one of the no, that's not true. Only machine gun that fires multiple projectiles. You're going to see a lot of multi-barreled guns. Vindicator is one such multi-barreled gun, but unlike those other multi-barreled guns on this tier list, this one actually fires both barrels at the same time. Instead of alternating barrels, it's going to actually fire both barrels at the same time. So half the damage is dealt from each bullet. This allows you to spread your damage on your opponent. So this means that it is good at hogging off parts, but not necessarily stripping specific parts. That said, the Vindicator is a staple of CW. It is extraordinarily durable. It is quite oppressive, and because of the fact that you can actually put down a wall of fire that like basically whittles away your opponents over distance, setting timing, attacks, etc. Makes it very, very interesting. Also, the Vindicator is probably one of the, if not the best decloaking weapon in the entire game, as it will allow you to rapidly put down a very wide swath of bullets, you know, and in the attempts to decloak multiple opponents at the same time, or anyone who's coming around a corner. So with that said, the Vindicator is an A tier gun. Next up, we have the Gremlin. The Gremlin is a front-facing shotgun whose perk is melee-oriented. You have to ram your opponent, and you can get up to 30% bonus damage depending on the speed that you were going right before you hit them. The Gremlin also has a secondary perk where it has damage pass-through, for those of us who didn't know. So that means that its actual durability is doubled from bullets, though this means that you shouldn't be using the Gremlin to try and protect yourself, necessarily, from the side. From the front, because of this, the actual length of the Gremlin's hitbox, you can actually keep parts behind that, like such as your cabin, protected from damage, simply because the damage pass-through isn't enough. You can't get, it's more than the 7-pin rule. So with that said, the Gremlin falls in ye old shotgun meta, does work, is great, and will work basically whenever you want to use it. The only problem is that using it with the perk can be somewhat annoying, and with the additional power score increase, basically you're going to end up fighting more and more powerful opponents. So for that reason, the Gremlin is sitting around B tier. Next up is the Parser. When this weapon came out, everyone had them, everyone used them, and in fact, everyone still has them, because in the Battle Pass, that when this was released, it gave you 2 fused Parsers. And those 2 fused Parsers go a very long distance. This gun was the subject of multiple nerfs, one after the other, repeatedly over and over again. One to fix a bug with the Torero cabin, and because of the fact that it made it a literal laser. You could actually out-snipe people with scorpions. So that had to be fixed. But other than that, they nerfed a lot of things about the Parser. They nerfed its maximum range when fully charged. They nerfed the time it takes for it to charge, etc., etc. And after doing all of that, the Parser still lands in A tier. The Parser is still oppressive. The range on it is still ridiculous. The thing reaches nearly 300 meters, if I recall correctly. I think it reaches like 275 meters. It is phenomenally good at poke. It is far better than it should be, even though it is really, really good. Its sheer existence nearly obsoletes an entire class of shotgun, the reloading shotguns. It is arguably the best reloading, I would argue one of the best, if not the best reloading shotgun, and it obsoletes many of the other reloading shotguns on the list, simply because of how good it is. It's because you do not have to charge it. You can simply blatantly tap fire it, and that will then give you a damage blast. The perk of the Parser is more damage on your next shot based on the number of pellets that hit on the last shot. So, A tier. Next up, we have the Argument. The Argument is very much like the Summoner. It has a slightly worse hitbox, slightly larger, and it actually has, unlike the Summoner, actually has a perk. The perk of the Summoner is that you deal more damage, if I recall. No, I think it reloads faster. Yeah, the Argument reloads faster based on the number of projectiles that you hit with. It does more damage than the Summoner, but in reality, it's not really any better than the Summoner. You really have to play around it. Its damage is good. So let's be clear. Its damage is good. But with the increase in power score, with the fact that you have to lead your shots exceptionally, so it makes it, even though it is a literal shotgun, it's a very difficult shotgun to use. Very similar to Summoner, C tier. Next up, we have the Destructor, released in the same battle pass as the Parser. These things rock the house. I have a analogy for them. They're basically if you're ever at a bar and you see a dude wearing one of those members-only jackets, leather members-only jackets sitting at a bar, and you're like, that dude fucks, that's the Destructor. S tier. The Destructor is exceptionally strong. It has far too many synergies with all of the energy weapon buffs in the game. And it exploits every last one of them. You can use this with a trombone on an overheated opponent to do 2,800 plus damage. You can do, photon cabins. You can do whatever you want with the Destructor. These are staples in Leviathan Clan Wars. They're staples in Clan Wars. They're staples in standard PvP. Whenever you see a Destructor player on the battlefield, they are a priority target because of how insanely strong they are. The Destructor, the perk of the Destructor is that as the weapon fires, it overheats the opponent on its own. Basically, the laser overheats them, so they're taking bonus damage just from the fact that it's firing. And then, if you manage to hit your opponent with every single tick of the laser, the final pulse will do 800% damage. It says 800% damage. What it means to say is a boatload of damage. Who knows what that percentage is based on, but it will do a brick ton of damage. So, because of that, you can remove people's parts, you can bore through their builds, you can do whatever it is that you want with the Destructor. It is great at component removal, and it's great at player life removal. Phenomenal weapon. Next up, we have the M25 Guardian. I do not like this gun personally. I don't like it. I've never had very much success with it. It feels very weak to me. However, from what I have heard, it is it's a consummate weapon. Everyone else who are better players than I comes to me and says, "Well, yo, Cardboard Ninja, M25 Guardian, phenomenal gun." And I will defer to everyone on this because they say that it is such a good gun. I know that I can do fairly well with it. It is a very defended gun. What ends up happening is the perk on the M25 Guardian is, as the weapon overheats, it gets damage reduction. So you fire the gun, as you get hit, it gains damage reduction up to 10%. It is not a true 10% damage reduction. I'll have to cover that later, but it's darn close. We're going to put the M25 Guardian at B tier because of the fact that it will function, it will do what you want. It is a gun that's worth having. I have 4 of these that are fused. I personally, again, don't like them, but that doesn't mean that they are bad. Next up, we have the Walts. The Walts rocket launcher, again, has a perk that allows the weapon to get increased damage on each subsequent shot. What this means is it will fire 3 shots. Each of the weapon's shots spirals Looney Tunes style, making it a corkscrew attack, making it very difficult to aim. But each subsequent rocket, not that hits the target, but that is launched, will deal more damage than the previous. It'll deal 25% more damage on the second rocket, and the third rocket will do 50% more damage than the first. The impulse of the rockets are also increased by 50 and then 100%. So hitting someone with all 3 rockets from 2 waltzes can be quite devastating. The weapon is very, 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 very strong. It is a turret, not a fixed facing weapon. So it works very well with the oppressor. When used appropriately, the waltz can do phenomenal damage. But the problem is it's got issues with reliability. You can see this weapon in CW occasionally as a long-range alternative. You can see it attached to enemy Leviathans as a supplement for retro DPS, not a replacement, but it struggles. It really does, because you really need to get very, 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 very good with this gun to deal damage. When you do get good, you will do a load of damage, but you have to get very good, which means that it is a C-tier weapon. You've got to predict shots far in the future. Far in the future. You think leading shots is hard? This weapon charges up to fire. So you charge up to fire, leading your shots in the future, correcting for projectile velocity and the fact that the projectile is spinning around. It's exceptionally difficult to land all 3 shots with the Waltz over any appreciable distance, but the damage is real. So C tier. Next up, we have the Jormungandr. The Jormungandr originally was released, and everyone was like, what the heck is this thing? It does boatloads of damage, as do all shotguns, but the problem with the Jormungandr is that, unlike other shotguns, it's not durable. It's got a massive hitbox. It can be stripped off of you. It's fun in lower power scores, which is surprising, because you can compare this with other burst shotguns. So with that said, we're going to put it in B tier. Its damage is good, but I've never seen a Jormungandr build actually truly meta ultra compete in CW yet. Someone will probably hop in the comments below and say, I've got a Jormungandr build and that's the only thing I use. Fair enough, but the price came down initially and they had to buff it at least once, and even then I don't think that it's going to compete against other shotguns or other weapons that would actually be brought into endgame. Once again, not a raid weapon because it's a shotgun, but there you go. Next up, we have the Yokai, released recently in a pack. The Yokai is a very interesting gun. It is the first weapon in Crossout that you do not want to hit your opponent with. So we're going to put that right where it belongs, in D tier. So here's the reason why it's in D tier. This is a very bad weapon. It's just very bad. You can get some phenomenal fun shots in with the Yokai. You can land a shot next to someone at low power score when they're using a gas gen, and then you blow them up. But this game is not Overwatch. This game is not Quake. This game is not a weapon where you're able to get verticality over your opponent at will. So what does that mean? The overall idea is, with the Yokai, it would be great if you were looking down at them like Pharah from Overwatch and you fire rockets right next to them and they can't dodge them and they blow up. That's what the Yokai's perk is. The perk says that the blast radius and damage from the Yokai does not reduce at distance from the epicenter of the explosion as long as you miss. Any shot that hits the ground or doesn't directly hit your opponent gets this boost. So when you hit them with the Yokai, you do less damage. Very counterintuitive. You can't necessarily get to the elevation necessary to fire down at your opponent in order to land your shots next to them at all times. If they take the high ground against you, you are royally boned. It's It's just a very difficult weapon to use, and even then, there are significantly better alternatives everywhere. Next on the D tier is the Vulture. Even after its a perk update, it's going to be probably closer to, well, it's going to be closer to C tier, but it's D tier right now. Probably the worst drone in the entire game. The Vulture has the following issues. It will, let's just go with the perk. First, you fire drones off onto the battlefield. After landing, those drones will go invisible, and they will basically perform as a guard in the area. Any foe that drives underneath these invisible drones, the drone will decloak and then fly at them menacingly. If they're traveling too fast, this means that the drone will never connect with them because it's not a projectile. The drone itself is the weapon. So the drone, if it does connect, which, by the way, it will never target their cabin, unless the cabin is the last part on their vehicle. It will target any other component first, mostly targeting wheels or exposed generators or weapons. It will attach to one of those things, hopefully, as long as it doesn't hit something in the way. And then it will grind for 33 damage, I think 2 times before exploding for a significant sum of damage with almost no blast radius. After the perk updates, it's going to grind far more, so it will do more damage to the component that it hits. And then its explosion radius will be increased by 80%, meaning it will actually be able to damage a nearby component, but the explosion damage is going to be cut by over 50%. So what do I think of the Vulture? The Vulture is remarkably bad. It takes time to use, it takes time to set up. Crossout is a very fast game, so in this game, the Vulture just doesn't work out. There are better turrets that do almost the exact same thing, that deal damage immediately, instead of dealing damage potentially sometime in the future, maybe. Getting a killing blow with the Vulture is one of the luckiest things you can ever achieve. In order to hit someone in the cabin, or in order to hit someone's explosives, you just have to be lucky. Like, crazy lucky. Like, it's got to target the wheel, and then they got to get flipped over, and then, like, just for the point, right before the point of impact, right before the thing hits the wheel, someone, like, pushes them so it lands directly into their build to get a kill. And under those blue moon circumstances, the Vulture may get a kill. But other than that, this is among the worst weapons in the game. You are more helpless for bringing it, basically. Next up, we're on to the Spectre 2. Spectre 2 is one of the Tapfire machine guns in Crossout. It is a phenomenal gun. So you probably know where it's going already based on the fact that I said it's a phenomenal gun. It takes 4 energy. Its perk says that the more consecutive shots you land, the more damage that you deal. Spectre 2 is a adequate upgrade to its predecessor. It isn't as good as the Punisher, clearly. Nothing is going to be. But it's a good gun. Other than that, if you're into Tapfire machine guns, it is a good upgrade from its predecessor. It does make it so you punch harder, but its cost is pretty steep at 4 energy, as I mentioned earlier. Not much more to say other than that. Even though it has multiple barrels, this will affect its accuracy, though you probably won't notice. But yeah, other than that, good. Next, we go to the Mighty Lupara, one of the first weapons that anyone who starts Crossout will ever get. The Lupara is a ridiculously overpowered gun for what it is. The Lupara shouldn't be as strong as it is, but it is at B tier. You can take Luparas into 8K and win. It is just ridiculous. This is due to the fact that the Lupara has the same hitbox as the Sledgehammer and the Mace, and it is the genesis of said hitbox. It's very difficult to remove Luparas. It's very difficult to remove Sledgehammers. It's very difficult to remove Maces. So this means that these weapons, even though they are or should be abysmally weak, can be dragged abysmally high. They're your standard, typical fare with shotguns where you just W key and hold down left mouse button and watch big numbers come up. Very good gun. You don't need to do very much to make it good. Bury it in your build, and you're going to be just fine. Crazy that a common item can rank so high on a tier list. Next up, we have the Pyre. This is one of the favorite weapons of almost everyone in Crossout. They love it because of how common it is. They love it because of how cheap it is. The problem is the Pyre doesn't scale. Most people don't realize this. C tier. People love thinking, well, wait a minute, it's only 2 energy. Maybe I can just fit even more Pyres on my build. Well, the idea is this. As your opponent's builds become more robust, the Pyre's damage just doesn't keep up. It just simply doesn't. The DPS on the Pyre is low because of its long reload time. The ammunition on the Pyre is low. In addition, so what this does is it creates a very specific power score band that the Pyre can function in. And then in addition to that, the Pyre forces you to play in a very specific way. There's one build for the Pyre. Everyone knows what it is. You either have a Dusk Cabin or a Harpy Cabin, and all your Pyres are side mounted. Congratulations, everyone. You have the same build as everyone else. And that build, for some reason, you can see all the way up into 11K. I don't know why people drag that build into 11K. It is far outperformed at 11K. Everyone has better defensive options. And there's also a super mega hard counter to this called the Spark or the Flash, which is the reason why you don't want to be in 11K in the first place, because that's when you start seeing the Spark and the Flash. People can literally one-hit all of your missiles all at the same time and make you entirely disarmed instantaneously. You have to play very, 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 very well in order to make this weapon work. You can make it work at mid-low to low power scores, but at a certain point, you really got to let the pyre go, but a lot of people simply aren't going to because they're cheap. They're cheap thanks to the fact that they are craftable and also available in a pack. Next up, we have the Vector. The Vector is a really, really, really solid machine gun. Similar to Spectre 2, it's tap fire. It has no perk because it is a rare weapon, but the damage that it deals is very good. The only reason why it's not going to rank higher than what's about to rank is because of the fact that there are slightly better versions of the exact same gun, and that's B tier. If you have Vectors, yeah, go ahead and use them. If you're starting out in Crossout, go ahead and use them. As long as you stay mobile, and you don't let your opponents strip your guns, which is the #1 weakness of the Vector, the Spectre, and most machine guns, you're going to do just fine. You're going to do just fine. Great gun. Next up, we have the Fat Man. The Fat Man is a turreted cannon. Turreted cannons and linear cannons, which are the non-turreted versions, have very complex mechanics that I'll go into in a separate video, I'm sure. But the long and the short of it is, the Fat Man is the first of the downtrend of the efficacy of shotguns as you improve rarity. So, long story short, unfortunately, the Fat Man has a very bad geometry in comparison to its predecessors. It has decent hit points, and its perk is fine, but its natural reload speed overshadows its perk. What that means is, the perks of the Fat Man is that on a hit, you get half a second off of the reload of the Fat Man. That's pretty straightforward. The problem is this base reload time of the Fat Man, when compared to its predecessor, the Hulk, is so much greater that a hit with the Fat Man still takes longer to reload than I think a hit with or even a miss with the Hulk. It's pretty crazy, and that's unfortunate. The Fat Man has extraordinary hit points. Its hitbox is a little bit awkward to work with, and because the barrel is lower, you can't use the builds that you're using with the Hulk, which are actually quite good, with the Fat Man because the barrel is so low. With that said, the power score bracket of the Fat Man is starting to get ridiculous. No matter what, you're going to be fighting people who are on hovers, and you're going to start seeing the reason why the Fat Man and the turreted cannon ilk start to fall off at a certain power score bracket. And that power score bracket is right when hovers show up and start shitting on you from space because you can't keep up. You can't turn the turret fast enough. You can't hit them. If you miss, because this isn't a very accurate weapon, you suddenly waste all of your shots, or they can just keep coming in and just whittling you down. This is a very brutal weapon because of the fact that it's the first true introduction to what it's like to be outmatched. So for those reasons, it goes into C tier. It's not useless, but damn, it'll feel useless. You're gonna feel pretty bad when you're fighting hovers with that thing. Next up is the Spike. Spike is a sniper weapon, extraordinarily powerful. If it does about 198 damage per shot, the perk of the Spike is that it deals, air quotes, significantly increased impulse. What that means is that you can flip people over. You can do a lot of stuff with the Spike. In reality, you can skip that perk and look at its projectile size. If I am correct going over everything on the list, this is correct. The Spike is the very first weapon being ranked on this tier list that actually has a projectile size smaller than average. The average projectile size is like 1.5 pin diameter, which means that it's basically you're throwing a 3-pin wide brick at your opponent with basically every single weapon up here. All of these weapons that I have here, and the overwhelming vast majority of the weapons down here, you're sending basically telephone poles at your enemy. This includes machine guns, by the way. So the Spike has 75% reduced projectile size, which is to say you're firing a 1-pin object downfield. This means that you can hit some hard-to-reach back teeth, or more importantly, you can fire it through gaps in people's builds, and you can reach generators faster. And because it does blistering, as I said earlier, 198 something damage per spike, and you can get 3 to 4 spikes on a build, you can tunnel your way to China with this. You're not necessarily going to find this in CW, but where you do find it, it's to be feared. A tier. Next up is the RT Anaconda. If I recall correctly, the RT Anaconda is a turret, obviously, but this one fires a rocket. It is a homing rocket drone that is all that there is to say about it. I'm trying to think if there's anything special, but there really isn't. It doesn't really have a perk. The problem with this is twofold. One, rockets are low to the ground because the turret is low to the ground. So this means that if you place this on terrain that is low, it means it will never fire. So you cannot put the RT Anaconda, or should not put the RT Anaconda, in a crater or any place where the terrain dips, because it means it'll never get a log. Second, when someone simply drives by this, when it will fire, if the terrain is, just a little bit uneven, the RT Anaconda's rocket will end up hitting that terrain and not connect. Also, the fact that it will end up hitting allies, it'll end up blocking allies. There are a lot of problems with the RT Anaconda, a lot of them, which is the reason why, unfortunately, the RT Anaconda is going to D tier. You have to struggle with this weapon, truly. You can place the optimal place that you can put this on is a flat surface in the open, protecting a capture point, and that's all. And people can simply not drive near it, and they'll take no damage. So, not a good weapon. GL55 Impulse is the first grenade launcher in Crossout and is actually the component used to craft the Retcher and not the Thresher. GL55 Impulse has a perk that after 5 consecutive shots, the next grenade launched will do bonus damage. Ultimately, the GL55 Impulse has its problems. It fires too slowly, its grenades don't do enough damage, its hitbox is terrible. This is a weapon from another era, which you can tell because of the fact that it just simply doesn't have the panache of many other weapons on this list. So you're gonna have to try hard with it, but it is a high explosive weapon, C tier. Next up, we have the MG13 Equalizer. The Equalizer's perk, it is a minigun, first of all. So this means that it will constantly fire, does overheat, has a spin-up time, which means it will not instantly fire. Its turret traverse speed is much lower than things such as the Vector or the Spectre, so you have to lead your targets. You have to lead your targets, not because the gun itself is not hit scan. It is hit scan, but you have to lead your targets because of the fact if they're moving, the gun isn't going to be able to keep them in the center of fire. So you got to lead your targets ever so slightly with the Equalizer. Other than that, the damage is abysmal. It comes in very, 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 very weak. Its perk is that the longer it fires, the more damage it does, up to 105% bonus, if I recall correctly. So that's pretty good. 105% sounds really good, but you have to realize, I think the starting damage of the Equalizer is like 2 or 3. So there is that. This pairs exceptionally well with a weapon that's upcoming on this list called the Aurora. So if shooting heated parts, stripping people is really, really good with the Equalizer. But the problem is, in a stand and bang situation where if someone comes up to you at point blank range, if they close the distance, the Equalizer isn't going to keep up. Unfortunately, the Equalizer's damage is quite poor, but it is usable. But you're probably going to want to use something else. So that makes it a C tier gun. Also, the Equalizer's advantage is, even when fully spun up, the bloom of the weapon isn't that bad. It's not super precise, but it's not super bad either. Next up, we have the Whirlwind. This is a relic from another era. This is the lightsaber of Crossout. Not in that it's good or that it can cut through things, but because of the fact it's from a more delicate era. Basically, the Whirlwind's perk is the further away your opponent, the more damage you deal. And in Crossout, I'm sure you guys recognize that it's very important for you to close distance. And some of these weapons up here are all about closing distance. So what does that mean for the Whirlwind? Doesn't mean very much. Whirlwind is an unfortunate weapon because of the fact that even though its perk was good at one time, it is outperformed in so many different ways right now. It is so heavily outperformed by so many different things. If you fight at long range, you're outperformed by cannons or true sniper weapons that have yet to appear on this list. If you try to fight at mid-range, you're going to enter the realm of better weapons that are going to end up sniping you off again. Hit scan weapons, aka machine guns. There's just simply no zone that the Whirlwind outperforms another weapon. For that reason, it is unfortunately D tier. You can try your best, but it's going to be an uphill battle every single time you touch this gun. Its hitbox is absurd. Its durability is low. Any place that you try and mount it on your vehicle is going to be a pain. It has extraordinary kickback. It's just not very good. D tier. Next up, we have the Reaper. The Reaper is it's obviously a minigun, but unlike the Equalizer, the Reaper actually does have a perk that is not a perk. So the Equalizer does have a perk. The Reaper's perk is, it doesn't overheat. Thumbs up. Oh, wait, but it uses ammo crates. Ugh. So the Reaper's energy cost is 6, unlike the Equalizer's energy cost of 4 or any of these other weapons' energy cost being low. So that means that you can only have 2 on your build. So this actually means that the Reaper hits a very interesting economic price point. If you're trying to enter the realm of machine guns, but you don't want to pay very much because of the fact that you're cheap, like myself, you'll end up picking up some Reapers. And originally, that's what I did. The problem is, unlike the Equalizer and unlike every other machine gun in the game, the Reaper is not hit scan. So this means that the Reaper actually is firing actual projectiles that actually go across the screen. Okay, that's all right. So that's good, right? Not really. No, because it means that you have to excessively lead your target. It has an even slower turret traversal than the MG13 equalizer or anything else. It is extraordinarily difficult to deal continuous damage with the Reaper. Extraordinarily difficult. It is unfortunately super outperformed at what it's supposed to do, which is hog off parts. The Vindicator definitely outperforms it. In addition to that, because you only have two, it means that people only need to aim at two parts of your vehicle in order to strip you entirely. It's got a very large hitbox. It's very difficult to hide. A lot of people really like the Reaper. I'm actually one of the people who really liked the Reaper, but in reality, the fact that you were simply outperformed at every range that you're at, you're firing literal physical shells down range instead of having a hit scan laser attached to your vehicle. Also, the weapon bloom hurts this extraordinarily because of the fact that, again, you're firing actual projectiles, so you'll end up whiffing shots, so it's actually not even good at stripping parts unless that person is at point-blank range. So, because of the fact that this is basically a point-blank range-only gun and is outperformed by every other weapon of its exact same category, I'm struggling to put this into C tier. I don't want to give it a D tier. But seeing as we've got still tons and tons and tons of things left on this list, I'm going to have to place it. I'm going to put the put the Reaper into C tier. It is viable. You can make it work, but you're going to struggle hard making it work. You got to struggle real hard making that gun work. Next, on to the AC-64 Jewel. AC-64 Jewel does like 13 damage a shot, if I recall correctly, and its perk is that weapon cooling is increased the faster you drive. The Jewel fires fairly quickly, but it's extraordinarily inaccurate. It is an autocannon, and you can fit 3 of them on your build or so. The problem with the Jewel is that its blast radius on the autocannon is very weak. The damage on it is not very high. It's just a bad gun. In general, autocannons are pretty poor in this game. This extends that trend. It's, I want to say, better than the Whirlwind, but it's actually not. Its damage is really, really low. Because of the fact that it's doing blast damage, you're going to hit a lot of enemies' components, but because of the fact that it's blast, it's going to show you big numbers, but in reality, you're not doing very big numbers at all. For that reason, unfortunately, I gotta give my man a D tier. It isn't a very good gun. It just, unfortunately, isn't. You can drop, it looks good, it fires fast, it sprays downfield, you can get a lot of assists, but it's really not going to do the work. You're going to do like 400, 500 damage before removing a single part on your opponent, and by that point, they'll have removed something from you. Next up is the Emily grenade launcher. It is a very interesting grenade launcher because it actually has the same hitbox as the sledgehammer and Lupara, and the mace. Very small grenade launcher. It is a reloading weapon. You fire 6 shots and then it reloads. The Emily grenade launcher is fun, but not viable. You can actually have some fun with the Emily, but in reality, its DPS is lacking very, very much because you fire 6 shots and you're reloading forever, even with a fast reload build. You can make some really fun niche builds with it, C tier. Next up, we have the Wasp. The Wasp is the first rocket launcher on this list other than the Walts. Available at low tier, it is interestingly asymmetrical. So with weapons like this, you're going to want to mount them sideways to give them the most amount of protection. Yeah. Other than that, the Wasp has no perk, but it does fire 2 times per click, which means that its damage can be quite high. Its accuracy is very low, but other than that, it can be a quite brutal weapon in the right hands. On hovers, Wasps are deadly. In the right hands, Wasps are just sick when dragged into whatever power score they're into. They are a threat. And when protected appropriately, Wasps can be quite brutal. They do have a problem with barrel placement, though. Because of the way that these front-facing rocket launchers work, if you obfuscate any part of the barrel, the gun simply doesn't fire. And with later entry on this list, you're going to see, I'll explain further as to why that is exceptionally bad. But this means that with the Wasp, you may end up only firing 1 rocket out of your 2-rocket volley because you end up flagging your own build, which is to say, part of your barrel looks over your build at any given point in time, right in the middle of the firing process, and the second shot simply isn't fired. So for those reasons, B tier. It's a pretty solid gun. Next up, we have the Executioner 88, which is one of my absolute favorite weapons in the entire game. I love the Executioner. I really, really do. The problem with the Executioner is as follows. Again, you've got your kooky cannon mechanics in the game that I'm not explaining in this video because I ain't got time for that. But other than the kooky game mechanics, the Executioner actually has a lower DPS than its predecessor, the Prosecutor. The DPS comes down on the Executioner because of the fact that its reload rate has been hurt. Also, due to a buff to the Prosecutor, what ended up happening is the Executioner ends up in a weird situation where it's not as good as its predecessor. Very similar to the Fat Man with the Hulk. And the reason why it's not as good is because of the fact that the damage on the Executioner isn't what matters. What matters is the perk. And we're going to get into that right now. The Executioner is one of only a handful of weapons in the entire game, 3 in fact, that actually have true weapon penetration. True weapon penetration meaning that on impact, the projectile passes through the target and deals damage to things behind it. Not the projectile. In this case, the Executioner's explosive damage is transferred into the build and explodes 2 pins deep. This is identical to the Prosecutor. Now here's the problem. The Prosecutor fires faster, and that means that you're just trying to crit seek. So because of the fact that you're just trying to crit seek, which is to say hit high explosive parts on the interior of their vehicle, the more shots you send downrange, the better. And that means that the Prosecutor is better than the Executioner at that thing that the Executioner should already be good at. So unfortunately, that means the Executioner sits at C tier. You can make it work. I try to make it work. I have 3 fused Executioners. I love them to death. But unfortunately, they're outperformed by a weaker tier weapon on the exact same list. Next up, we have the Mandrake. It is the first artillery in all of Crossout. You basically aim straight up and hope to God that the shots come down. A while ago, there was something known as horizontal mandrakes, where you would tilt your build over, and that way you could fire all 5 of your mandrake shots directly into the tummy of your opponent, which made the mandrake a phenomenal weapon. Dual mandrakes were used in CW. They were actually a plague, a pox upon people's houses, and it was great. Unfortunately, Gaijin saw this and was like, no fun allowed, and they slapped everyone's PP and they made it so the Mandrake can only fire up, which is what it was designed to do in the first place. With that said, Mandrake is an indirect fire weapon in a game, a fast-moving game like Crossout, where some of the best weapons are point-blank weapons, so you can expect where this is going. It is a D-tier weapon, unfortunately. Some of the best players that I've seen with this weapon have moved on. I've seen people with fused mandrakes who have won CW matches solely with mandrakes on their own, and they have given up on the mandrake. Upcoming in the future release to the game, they're actually releasing a new artillery that, unlike the mandrake, will work. So the mandrake's #1 issue is the fact that it's dramatic. Even if it worked, it's dramatically inaccurate. You can be completely stationary, firing at a completely stationary target, and miss every single shot. The Mandrake's blast radius is huge. It leaves fire puddles on the ground, but missing a stationary target is inexcusable, especially when you have a targeting reticule that indicates that you're aiming directly at their soul. So, yeah, unfortunately, Mandrake is D tier. It's not very good. You're going to see people memeing with it, but you're not going to see very much else. Next up, we have the BC-17 Tsunami. God dang, if this tier list were made a year ago, things would be different. Tsunami is a very interesting gun, and unfortunately I keep trying to skip past these hidden perk things, but the Tsunami is the beneficiary of a hidden perk that states that if the bullet damage of the Tsunami, which is about half, it's 60% of the Tsunami's damage, destroys a part, then it's going to keep moving the explosion of the Tsunami, the 40% explosion damage of the Tsunami, deeper into the build until the bullet damage is entirely consumed. This gives it a minor penetrative effect, and with its 20 plus 20% damage perk, can actually deal more damage in a single hit than the CC-18 Typhoon. It is a really interesting weapon. Way back in the day, this thing used to be worth nothing, and now it's one of the more expensive legendaries. It was worth fusing during a fusion event recently because of the fact that this made the Tsunami freaking really, really good. Faster reload speed, faster projectile velocity, etc. BC-17 Tsunami is an interesting gun because it is deadly wherever you take it. You take it to high power score, take it to low power score, you can use it in CW. It's actually an S tier weapon. It wasn't before, but it is now. It's really quite ridiculous that the Tsunami has come up so quickly. Good on you, Tsunami. Good on you. Mind you, it took hidden perks that most people don't even know about to achieve, but good on you. Next up, we have the Goblin. Goblins are an insane weapon. Goblins are a shotgun, so it means that they're going to be good, but not only are Goblins good, they're great. They have the same hitbox as the Gremlin, except the difference is they don't have a listed perk. This is because originally Goblins were a rare weapon. When they introduced the special tier, they looked at the Goblin and was like, nah, this is good enough to be special. So they just increased the power score. But despite increasing the power score and giving it a bevy of nerfs, the Goblin is still quite insane. You can do so many builds with Goblins, just stacking them. They only take 2 energy, so there's just a problem. You can get so many of these on your build. So it's a shotgun, front facing, has damage pass through, can bully any power score that is brought to effectively S tier. Good shotgun. Get yourself some. The Synthesis. Synthesis is an interesting weapon because it is the first plasma ball gun on this list. You have to lead your targets. Its damage is okay. It does not have a perk. Its hitbox is large. Honestly, it's not a very good gun. There are better guns on this list. You're going to struggle using the synthesis, so D tier. The Quasar. Love the Quasar. Quasar is an interesting gun because it is the first plasma cannon on this list. Basically, the idea is 100% of the damage is blast. It is an energy blast weapon. Its perk is that the further away your target is when you land a hit successfully will reduce the reload time on the Quasar. When fused, these things are an absolute nightmare. When unfused, they're okay. They are just your standard linear cannon. Unlike cannons, such as the Tsunami, which have a projectile velocity and actually have bullet drop, the Quasar does not have bullet drop. So you can land some precise shots over great distances with the Quasar, provided you can predict things far, far in advance or get exceptionally lucky. This is actually a really good gun, surprisingly. B tier. Next up, we have the Aurora. The Aurora was one of the first weapons in the game that overheated, that in the Incinerator. It is a minigun, or has minigun properties, much like the Equalizer. And for those reasons, it pairs exceptionally well with the Equalizer and other things like that. It's a phenomenal gun in that right. A tier. The only other thing I would say about the Aurora off the top of my head is that if you're a new player, you should get an Aurora for raids. This will help you out so you can actually deal damage to opponents that are much stronger than you if you're ever gonna if you're reaching out of your power score band to try and get into some hard raids. Also, it means that you're not entirely useless in those situations because you can find out who your allies are attacking and overheat those guys to make it so they can deal damage. Thumbs up. The Aurora is just a really good gun. It used to be probably S tier, but due to the release of better things such as the Trombone, it kind of pulled it down because of the fact that there are other options that actually have better ranges. Whereas the Aurora actually is only a mid-range weapon. It actually does not have the same range as the Equalizer or the Arbiter. Other than that, A tier. Next up, we have the Rupture. The Rupture is a front-facing shotgun whose perk states that as you fire it, it has damage reduction. There you go. It's a bully weapon of bully weapons. You want to bully people? Use the Rupture. It actually is so insanely good. What can I say? You can mount it exceptionally low, just above frame height. You can find ways to make it so that no one can even shoot the Ruptures to begin with, and they have to shoot through a boatload of armor to get to them. They're just an A tier gun. They are very, very good. You can drive up into people. They will be on your build forever. You can find ways to averter them. They're just remarkably solid. Remarkably solid. Next up, we have the Spark. The Spark is one of the first lightning guns in the game. It fires a cone of energy. And by the way, for those who do not know, every last enemy target within that cone is hit. I think up to like 8 targets. Which means that this is the thing that completely obsoletes the Pyre. This will instantaneously pop all missiles. It hunts down mines. It's a really interesting support gun. The perk of the Spark is that any enemy hit by it will slowly have their energy drained, their power drained, which will slow down their vehicle. It works for melee builds. It pairs well with the Harvester because the Harvester's perk is something that needs to be debuffed in order for it to get its damage. So yeah, you're gonna see a lot of Spark builds, Spark Harveys. You're gonna see hybrid builds, which is usable in CW. The Spark is just in general a good gun, though it itself typically isn't going to be getting kills. You can find your Mimi builds where they're running around with 4 sparks or, a flash and 3 sparks and things like that. But those are just memes. Those aren't hyper effective builds by any means. But yeah, no, other than that, expect your Spark to get shot off because of its hitbox, and people don't like being slowed. So people are going to immediately try and shoot this thing off. But other than that, it's an A tier gun, definitely worth having. Next up is the STM-26 Tackler. This is a front-facing machine gun, very similar to the Guardian. This thing was, at one point in time, such a phenomenal gun that everyone needed it and wanted it, but for right now, the price of the Tackler is an all-time low because the thing got nerfed. It got nerfed really badly. Also because of the fact that, if I recall correctly, there's several packs that are available at this time that are bringing the price down, but that doesn't really matter. What really matters is that the Tackler got nerfed into such a way that it isn't reliably doing the damage that it was doing before. The perk of the Tackler is damage reduction to all sources except for energy when not firing. So this is the exact opposite of the Rupture, where you get damage reduction when firing. The Tackler, you want to not be firing, which is to say you've overheated, etc. The Tackler also overheats really quickly, if I recall correctly, when compared to other front-facing machine guns. It's got an interesting hitbox, and though it's not actually a symmetrical hitbox, so when you mount this on your build, it's going to be, if you have them mounted over, under, or side to side or whatever, you're going to get different firing arcs. That really doesn't overly matter, but ultimately the tackler is not as good as it used to be. Also, it has greater power score cost than the Guardian, so for those reasons, I'm going to have to put the tackler at C tier. Next up is the Leech. It is a front-facing shotgun, so you know where those go, but the problem is the Leech is not actually as good as the Spitfire. It suffers from increased power score, and in addition to the fact it suffers from an over-under barrel, whereas the Spitfire only has an over barrel. So for all of the things that you can do with the Spitfire to protect it, you can't do with the Leech. Though you can put 2 leeches in front of the Spitfire, that's good. So the leeches, which will extend the lifespan of your Spitfire, the leech's perk is when the leech is not firing, or reloading specifically, it has damage reduction. So this favors very aggressive play, which is good, but in reality, it's not as good as other guns of its kind. So for those reasons, I'm going to put the Leech at B tier. It's good, but I mean, it's outperformed by other shotguns at the exact same time. Next up, we have the Gravistar. Gravistar is an energy shotgun. Just so we're clear, I would like to make this very clear. Even though it's an energy shotgun, it doesn't count as shotgun. So this means that you can have Gravistars and shotguns on a Leviathan and not reach the cap of the amount of energy that you're trying to reach with shotguns. I'm not saying that you should, I'm saying that you can. Other than that, the Gravistar boasts an impressive fire rate and an insane DPS. Probably one of the highest DPS weapons in the entire game. The Gravistar can strip any build down to its component parts in seconds. The perk of the Gravistar is that after it overheats, which is to say you fire at every shot in the Gravistar, the gun literally overheats and glows gold. Well, not gold, it basically overheats and it takes plus 100% damage. This is very bad, except the very next shot fired by the Gravistar, every individual laser contains within it the power to overheat your opponent, very similar to the Arbiter earlier on the list. I'm sorry, is that correct? The Aurora earlier on this list, meaning you can instantaneously overheat your opponent to maximum with the Gravistar while continuing to fire. This creates rather oppressive builds that you can strip people apart. You can do so much damage. It's insane. The only downside to the Gravistar is that its durability is 198 or something like that, which means that its true durability, because it's always going to be overheated, is 96 or 97. Pretty insane, which means that this weapon's going to get slapped off your build. If anyone sees a glowing Gravistar, they simply send some damage at it and just slap that paper thin thing right off your build. Mind you, even though it's paper thin, that means that they're paper thin regardless of how durable they believe their build to be. So with that said, the Gravistar is a B tier weapon. It is extraordinarily good when used in certain ways, and actually in any power score that you bring it to, it is a true threat, a very dangerous weapon indeed. Next up, we have the ZS-52 Mastodon, an extension up from the Fat Man. It ditches the reload perks and goes straight for some very interesting fire. It's got 2 barrels and kind of uses them. Basically, if you tap fire it, it does about the same damage as the Mammoth, its predecessor, but unlike this, if you hold it down, it will overcharge and it will fire 2 shots instead of 1. The first shot will overheat and the second shot will deal damage, so can be brutal. The Mastodon suffers from the fact that you can't really drag it too far down, but you can drag it pretty far down in power score. This is because of the fact that you simply bring the Mastodon only, wheels, a cabin, and call it good. Interestingly enough, this thing excels in a lot of different power scores and is fun to play, which makes it an A tier gun. It works in CW, it works in lower power scores because of the fact the Mastodon has so many crazy hit points that you can use this as a secondary cabin. Just insane. Just some insane stuff. Good gun. Next up is the Median. The Median, if I recall correctly, doesn't have a perk, but the Median does do something interesting. The Median is similar to the Spike, and it has an extraordinarily small projectile, which is basically what a sniper weapon should have. If I recall correctly, this is the lowest quality sniper weapon in the game, and this is reflected by the fact that what most people don't realize is that when you're moving, the weapon bloom is insane on this thing, so you're not going to be able to get precise hits on a hover. The reason why the Spike is good is because of the fact that it maintains its accuracy on a hover. Median, you lose that accuracy. So basically it is a ground-based sniper weapon, which brings it down a tier basically immediately. In addition to that, it's got autocannon-esque properties, and it also has cannon-esque properties. It does not require ammunition, but it does do a significant sum of damage to parts. You kind of get what you get when you get this weapon, but it's kind of brutal because of the fact that it doesn't work exceptionally well on hovers. You can make it work if you try, but you're working against yourself, so that's kind of a C tier gun. Next up, we have the Flash. Flash is the big brother to the Spark. Works exactly the same way. Everything I said for the Spark is true with the Flash, but the Flash additionally affects the reload and cooling of weapons on your opponent. This can be exceptionally brutal, especially because of the fact that this gives them only whatever's in their clip to fight you. What that means is if you rush someone who's using retros with the Flash, if they were firing their retros before, they have only basically what's left in their gun before their weapon overheats for them to defeat you, and that's really, really brutal. This thing is exceptionally brutal against that kind of play. Other than that, though, you don't really see it dragged too far out of its power score brackets, but when you do, its efficacy kind of wanes. It's not really, again, the Flash and the Spark, those things don't necessarily deal the damage. They are debuffers that help you deal damage. You can see some mid to low tier Flash builds, and because of that, I'm definitely going to probably give this an S tier rating. The Flash is very, 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 very brutal when it's brought to bear against people who know what they're doing, and it's decent enough against others even when they don't. It also hard counters a couple of other weapons on the list where you need multiple Sparks to hard counter those. You only need a singular Flash. Up next is the Nest. This is a vertically firing missile launcher system that has a very, very interesting set of mechanics. First, we're going over its perk, which is to say after you've fired upon an opponent, the next time you choose to lock onto them, you're going to lock faster. Okay, fair enough. The second thing is it can fire up to 6 missiles, which you basically need to keep them in line of sight and target them for the entire duration. And as you do, the missile launching tubes that are on the top of the nest open up, and once it finally gets its last lock, it will fire. You can launch earlier than that by simply opening 1 to 5 tubes by simply releasing left mouse button to launch your missiles. Missiles then fly through the air with some extraordinary grace and targeting, and they affix themselves randomly to the top of their build. It used to be that the nest always auto-targeted their cabin, and it had some weird pass-through, so it always ended up on the underside of the cabin where it blew up their generators, and the nest used to be super powerful. But once they fixed all those things and then nerfed the crap out of the nest's damage, it has become very bad. It's very poor. All the mechanics combined does not make the nest good here. The damage on it is exceptionally weak. The missiles that come down can be destroyed very similarly to that of the Phoenix. Unlike the Phoenix, though, you cannot choose to land your shots low underneath their weapons accuracy, or the weapons place that they can actually on their build shoot the little spiky missiles that are stuck to their build off. So that means that the nest shoots and it comes down, and if they choose to clean themselves off, they clean themselves off, and then they take no damage. So, and the amount of time that you pay in order to launch those missiles and to get those hits is insane. So you have to pay a significant amount of time investment into getting your missiles to your target, and even then, all the counterplay in the game, they can cloak before the missiles get to them, which is the most standard thing. They can have an Argus that will remove the missiles off of them or even shoot them down in the middle of the sky. They can have Friends shoot the missiles off. The missiles don't do very much damage, and if they destroy a part that other missiles are attached to, the other missiles explode at that very instant, and if that's not close enough in the build, that does minimal damage. The weapon's just garbage. Unfortunately, it's a garbage weapon. You're shooting yourself in the foot for using it. Next up, we have the Snowfall. It is an aggressive rocket launcher. It is a front-facing rocket launcher whose perk says that you take 50% damage from the Snowfall's rockets. So the idea is you're supposed to ram into your opponent, and hit them with rockets at point-blank range. It charges an overfire. You charge up the shot to fire. Other than that, it functions very similarly to the Walts. It's a triple-barreled rocket launcher. But the difference is that the rockets launched by the Snowfall, they don't suffer from spinning around in circles. They don't spin at your opponent. They don't spiral at them. They go straight-ish, though they have an extreme projectile drop. With that said, it's technically just better than the Waltz in those regards. If you're using the Snowfall appropriately, you can actually get it pretty far. It's pretty good. B tier. Next up, we have the Kaiju. Kaiju is a sniper weapon. It takes 11 energy, the first of its kind. No weapon to date. I'm sorry, it takes 12 energy now that I think about it. It was nerfed into taking 12 energy for some reason to screw over heavy cabins, I'm sure. Yeah. It's a very, very large, very, very heavy weapon that's perk is if you manage to hit an opponent with the entire volley of the Kaiju, you overcharge it and it fires multiple shots like a machine gun. They are no longer hit scan. When the Kaiju was released, it was hit scan. They changed it so it is no longer hit scan. If you manage to hit someone with every single one of those shots, the next time you fire the Kaiju, you deal 20% more damage with that entire volley. So this can be a good gun in the right hands. But ultimately, there are better weapons that do basically everything that the Kaiju does. You can actually, unlike some guns though, you can actually drag this into CW, though only just. Only just. The Kaiju is extraordinarily durable, with over 1,000 durability on it. It's a prime candidate for an inverter. Trying to drag it into lower power scores typically doesn't work because the refire rate isn't usually fast enough to hit all those fast movers. But you can find a lot of really, really, really good snipers with this. The problem is that it's... I don't know, it's just too large. So the idea is this. Even though it's got a lot of hit points, it's exceptionally large. So you're going to end up seeing some very specific builds built entirely around trying to protect the Kaiju itself. So you're going to have builds that are like... it's hard to say. They're basically like corridors where you're trying to prevent damage from the side from hitting Kaiju, etc. This is one of the only weapons that you can even use with the Machinist cabin. You can use it. It does snipe, but there are significantly better weapons at the job. We're going to put it at C tier. You got to build entirely around this weapon in order to achieve basically just menial amounts of success. Next up, we have the Locust. The Locust is very similar to the Wasp because it's basically the epic version of the Wasp. Unlike the Wasp, the Locust actually has a perk, which is if you manage to hit someone with both rockets, the next time you fire, you have got increased blast radius. This is very, 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 very good. In the right hands, the Locust is an exceptionally brutal weapon for people who spend their entire time using hovers and becoming very good at setting up Locust traps where you end up putting these near train plows vertically mounted. These things are ridiculous. They can be insanely annoying to deal with. Basically, if someone is a true sniper with these things, they're going to do a lot of damage. And they're going to do it very quickly because the refire rate on the Locust is actually quite low for what it does and for what it is. So with that said, Locust is definitely better than the Wasp. It can be used in CW. And in fact, basically anywhere you see someone using a Locust, they're pretty impressive with it, especially if they're on hovers. So for those reasons, on hovers, I would say it's an S tier gun. So for that reason, I will say it's an S tier gun for here, because you're not going to necessarily see the Locust used elsewhere, because most people don't use rockets not on hovers. Next up is the Yaoguai. The Yaoguai is a drone launcher. Basically, the perk of the Yaoguai is that for the first second or so after the Yaoguai's drone acquires a target, it's going to do a little bit of bonus damage. This is exemplified, or this is personified by a red laser that goes from the drone to the target, and it just shows you, this is the guy I'm targeting, and at that point, it's going to do a little bit more damage on firing. Other than that, the Yaoguai is just a drone launcher. You literally launch hover drones across the battlefield. Unlike the most recent drone launcher, which is the Vulture, there's an interesting property of the drones of the Yaoguai. If you hit your opponent directly, there's a chance your drone gets destroyed. So there is that. The Vulture does not, the drones don't get destroyed. Other than that, the drones don't necessarily do that much damage. They can perform area denial. They're really, really annoying, but other than them being annoying, they aren't exceptionally meta. Even if you build, like, your build almost is irrelevant with the Yaoguai, to be honest. If you could be a cabin and maybe a movement part, and that'll do it, it's you just in the weapon. So you can make it work. You can deal damage, you can get kills, but it's not exceptionally good. C tier. Next up is the Jiboku. The Jiboku is Mind Cancer personified. Long story short, each shot, I'm using air quotes there, fires one of the Jiboku's drones. If you look on the picture, it has 2 little barrels, and there's a reason why it has 2 barrels, because it fires 2 shots. You need to fire both shots before the Jiboku decides to start reloading. The shots have significant impulse to yourself, so it can end up flipping your build, so you have to be careful not to put it on too light of a build. But other than that, the drones, when they land, create nodes on the ground, their mines, that fire a tether at enemies that try to pass by them. Very similarly to a cap can. But the difference is that unlike a cap can, it's not going to affix them to the ground and they can just drive away. This drains their cabin's energy, much like they're being hit by a spark. And this, by the way, is an energy weapon. So if you have things that boost energy weapons or effects of energy weapons, the Jiboku will be buffed by this. Unlike the cap can, the Jiboku's mines will only ever target one opponent at a time. They will not fire a second tether. But they can create interesting area denial. They can do interesting damage. But in reality, as a weapon system, you're working around playing in a very silly way while people are just W keying at you to kill you. C tier. Next up, we have the Tempura. It's a favorite weapon of one of my viewers. It's a interesting weapon that does thermal damage. It is one of the only weapons that has penetrating effects. It will penetrate up to 6 pins deep, if I recall correctly. And it does a fair amount of damage. The Tempura is a very interesting weapon because it's one of the few weapons that when not fused, its damage is abysmally low. Actually, it's not abysmally low. It's decent, but it could be significantly better. If you take the duration increase fusion, or are lucky enough to get a duration fused Tempura, it means that your damage increases by something like 30%. Because you get an additional tick out of it, and each tick does an insane amount of damage. The Tempura is one of those weapons that was originally released into Crossout with a different mindset. The idea behind the Tempura was released in the Syndicate package, the whole Tokyo Drift stuff, that you were supposed to activate the Tempura and drive by your opponent and rake their build and do a buttload of damage to them. It's going to be amazing. That didn't work out. Nobody does that. That's not a thing. What everyone does is they do the exact same thing they do with shotguns, which is they ram you and then fire the Tempura. And if the Tempura reaches your generator, you die. This creates a very interesting playstyle that is hyper effective in very specific power scores, but outside those power scores, it will struggle dramatically. It struggles against certain movement types, such as hovers and legs. It struggles in a lot of different places, but it does, of course, one hit when it does one hit. With that said, you can make it work, but it's not ideal. C tier. Next up, we have the Yongwang. This is one of the more overpowered weapons in Crossout. Overpowered meaning that for its rarity, this thing reaches far outside of the scope and bounds of what it should do. This thing functions very similar to the Fortune on the list, except it does everything the Fortune does, but better. The Yongwang fires 5 exploding balls, and those 5 balls deal boatloads of damage. If I recall correctly, they have very low hit points and are countered by the spark and the flash, specifically the flash. Other than that, the perk of the Yongwang says the Yongwang deals increased damage based on the number of energy used on your build, not towards weapons. So, for example, if you put on a carjack, or if you look on anything in the module tier list that I have, any of those will increase the Yongwang's damage. This creates a phenomenally overpowered synergy between the Yongwang and the Cockpit. Cockpit Wang builds, as mentioned in that tier list, are exceptionally brutal at a very, very, very narrow power score band, which is about 11.5k, where the Cockpit Yongwang just is brutally dominant. All the energy that you spend on the boosters that make you go faster, which are used to give you a damage boost from the Cockpit, are also doubled down on the Yongwang, increasing your damage by 15%. For each component as well. So the Yongwang hits exceptionally hard in an exceptionally narrow power score band, making it an exceptional threat in that band, but not a threat outside necessarily of that band too terribly far. But that is still an A-tier weapon when you can slap an entire build in half and send them back to their garage instantaneously. Viable. Next up, we have the Skinner. Not a weapon that deals damage. The Skinner is a very interesting weapon where you basically become a cap can. You harpoon your opponent. This is another weapon with penetrative effects. That's right, chat. That's right. This weapon penetrates. Penetrates 2 pins of structure when it hits. So that way, if for example, you hit a surface piece, the penetrative effect of the harpoon will affix it to the piece behind that. So you can actually, it makes it so that they can't so easily detach themselves, or get detached unless they lose a significant chunk of their build, usually. This is a staple weapon for Mine Tugs, and this is a staple weapon in Levy CW. It's a staple weapon in CW. It's just a staple weapon. It's a very, very, very strong weapon when used by very, very, very intelligent people, and can be very, very, very effective because it can make your opponent go where you want them to. This is extraordinarily brutal, but because it can't kill on its own, that makes it a B-tier weapon. Next up, we have basically use it in conjunction with better weapons or teammates, gameplay, etc. You can do some crazy stuff. That drags it down into like C tier, but the sheer fact that it's so freaking strong at what it does, it brings it back right up towards A tier. So middle road, B tier. Next, I recommend everyone has a Skinner. Next up is the Junk Bow. The Junk Bow is a reloading shotgun, very similar to the Parser, except unlike the Parser, the Junk Bow has no perk because it was originally a rare weapon, moved up to the special tier. Long story short, you get close, you left mouse button, it does cannon damage at point blank range. It's just a good gun. B tier. It's not going to be doing too terribly much beyond that, but in every power score that you bring it to effectively, which is mid-low power score, it's going to do very well. Next up is the Harvester. Harvester, it can be horizontally or vertically mounted. It is a melee weapon that is 10 pins long, which is insane, giving it an insane surface area. Recently, it got nerfed. It used to have 760 something durability. They really reduced it to 576 durability for some reason. But despite its nerf, it is the best at what it does. Unfortunately, what it does is not very nice. That is a Wolverine quote. The Harvester's perk says that it will deal double damage to any opponent that is under the effects of any status effect. So a status effect includes but is not limited to the Spark and the Flash's nerf to your speed, the Jiboku's nerf to your speed, the Enlightenment's revealing aura, and being overheated by any means. The interesting issue with that perk is that for overheated parts, while it will do bonus damage to the overheated parts, if it's connecting to a part that is not overheated, the Harvester does not get its perk. The Harvester is a staple of hybrid builds for CW. It's a staple of melee builds. It is just a very solid staple and is one of the strongest melee weapons in the entire game for these reasons. Just because of the fact that it's 10 pins. Being 10 pins means that once you start getting hit by it, there's almost no escape from it. Though it was nerfed recently to reduce its hit points, it is still very, 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 very effective. A tier. Next up, we have the Mammoth. The Mammoth is very similar to the Mastodon. The Mammoth's perk is that every consecutive hit increases the damage the Mammoth deals by 20%. That's not a typo, that's 20% per consecutive successful hit, meaning that it caps at 60% bonus damage. The Mammoth can slap very, 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 very hard. For very, very accurate people, the Mammoth hurts. It's also got thousands of hit points. This is another weapon that you can drag in low power score, exactly like the Mastodon. It's pretty brutal when you do that too. Though it will, of course, struggle against hovers. It does have a place in certain C-dub matches. It is actually a pretty darn good gun, just in general. And for that reason, we're going to give it A tier. It's really brutally simple. Land your shots, do more damage, take damage back because it's got durability. It's very difficult to strip for that reason. Just keep hammering them. Mammoth on reload builds is pretty brutal. Next up is the infamous Scorpion. Let's just put it on S tier because everyone knows that's where it's going. The Scorpion is an exceptionally annoying weapon. It is the weapon in the game with the greatest amount of penetration possible at 7 pins, the game's highest. The Scorpion deals damage very interestingly. The first object hit by the Scorpion takes full damage, and every subsequent part that it does hit will take 10% less damage than that. So that means that 6 pins out, the 6th object hit will take 60% less damage. However, the Scorpion's damage is so high, that means that there isn't a single structural part in the game that can survive this damage. Pass-through parts can, but no true structural part can. Also, some bumpers can. But double Scorpions is going to punch through just about every single part in the entire game, which makes this the quintessential sniper weapon for removing key components off of your build. If someone has an exposed generator, expect it to be popped. Expect them to pop your generator through frame. Expect pain from all directions. The Scorpion is one of the most annoying weapons to see at lower power scores, especially when put on the tops of hovers. It's exceptionally annoying when combined with the reload modules. It's exceptionally annoying when combined with cap cans, you name it. Scorpion's just one of the most annoying weapons to deal with. It is a true threat at every power score that you see it. It is just brutal. Next up is the Borer. The Borer is an interesting melee weapon. It's very similar to the Harvester. It's just your standard run-of-the-mill melee weapon. You ram into them, it deals damage. The Borer is very interesting because when you get it at a certain power score, it is it's crazy effective. The Borer is so low, it has such a low power score that you can end up taking this into builds or into fights below 4K. And below 4K, most new players don't have bumpers. And because they don't have bumpers, it means the Borer gets to just have its way with anyone. It's remarkably brutal at exceptionally low power scores. But once you get to mid-tier, Borers disappear. Their damage just falls off. They are only useful in a very specific power score band. And that's unfortunate because it's a pretty good weapon. In general, it's a pretty good weapon, but that very specific power score band does drop off eventually, and that makes it a C tier weapon. But when it is good, it's good. Like, you just, it's good when it is good. Well, actually, no, I'm going to put it in B tier, now that I think about it. Because it does dominate. The Borer dominates the power scores that it's good in, but it falls off pretty rapidly. It's good in a very specific power score band, so B. Next up, we have the Lacerator. The Lacerator is like a midway point between the Harvester and, let's say, the Borer. The Lacerator is not craftable. The Harvester, it does have a perk. I'm sorry, the Lacerator does have a perk. And the perk of the Lacerator is every mounted chainsaw has more durability, 15% more durability per Lacerator. This is very interesting because this means that now Lacerators have more hit points than Harvesters. What the hell? Well, Gaijin. But regardless of this, Lacerators are interesting because they have a very wide surface contact area, though significantly less than that of the Harvester, unfortunately. If I recall correctly, the surface area of the Lacerator is 1/2 that of the Harvester. Other than that, it's going to end up struggling outside of a certain power score band, but when you bring Lacerators, if you bring them and mount them appropriately, you can do some major damage. Vertically mounted Lacerators are usually the way to go, by the way, if you're interested. Horizontally mounted means that you're trying to destroy movement parts, but by the time you start doing that, you're going to be up against opponents that are going to be using wheels that are either too strong, or they're going to start using movement parts that are already naturally resilient to this. So this means that the Lacerator kind of ends up in a very interesting spot. It's good when it's good, and it can be great when it's great. And it's definitely worth having. So we're gonna put it at B tier. It doesn't exactly fall off either. You can actually end up doing exceptionally good with this. A viewer of mine actually saw a build of mine, made a build that was very similar to my build, and just started clapping cheeks with Lacerators. So they do it. Oh, final point of note. Actually, I should bring this up when I bring up the Mauler. And actually, I'll just skip to the Mauler right now just to get this out of the way. The Mauler and the Lacerator both do 50 damage. Psych, the Mauler's base damage is actually lower. The Mauler's base damage is actually 45. But the reason why it doesn't go to 45, it doesn't show you 45, is because the Mauler's perk is to deal more damage based on the number of based on the number of Mauler chainsaws on your build. So because of that, its 45 damage is increased to tick a 50, but the Lacerator's base damage is actually 50. So the Lacerator actually does more damage than the Mauler. We're just going to cover the Mauler and the Lacerator right now. Yeah, B tier. The Mauler is a very interesting weapon, because the fact that its geometry allows it to slip underneath people's builds, attack their weak frames. Other than that, it's just solid. It pairs well with the Lacerator. Good to go. One final note about the Mauler is that the Mauler has a very similar purpose to the Tempura, where you're attempting to reach up underneath your opponent's build and hit them in the generator. The difference is, though, the Tempura doesn't take damage most of the time when this occurs, because the explosion damage from the generator isn't going to come back and damage the Tempura. But it will damage the Mauler, and that will eventually strip your Maulers from your build. But the reason why the Mauler still ranks higher is because it's just easier to use. Tempura requires precise timing, whereas the Mauler requires no timing whatsoever. If at any point in time your chainsaws caress the underside of their cabin, they lose. Next up is the Draco. Draco is an interesting gun. It is like the Remedy, and very much like the Firebug, because it's a fire weapon. But the difference between this and the Firebug is it's front-facing. It has the most narrow firing arc of any of the directed flame weapons. I've said this before in a previous video. I'll say this again just to make sure everyone knows. Fire weapons don't do damage with the graphic of the flame that comes off of them. They deal damage with a slow-moving projectile that it fires. It is not AoE. It is simply has a very wide projectile cone. So each iterative shot fires more or less a spread pattern. This allows you to hit multiple different targets, giving the illusion of AoE. Other than that, the Draco has the same fire rate as the Remedy, which is about 10% faster than that of the Firebug. They nerfed its damage recently. They nerfed its ammunition recently to bring it down. It was a phenomenal gun then. It's still a phenomenal gun now. You can use it in just about any power score, and it is a quintessential dog weapon. You're going to find it all over the place at A tier. You can get 3 of them on your build. You can place them in a triangle pattern, and you can just W key at people. The perk of the Draco and the perk of the Firebug and the perk of the Remedy are all exactly the same. It's just a flame weapon. It doesn't have anything specifically listed. It's just overheats parts. Other than that, yeah, even after all of its nerfs, Draco, still a good gun. Next up is the Fortune, and I did not get this joke until very recently. It's the reason why this weapon is called the Fortune is because it fires a wheel. Wheel of Fortune. The Fortune is strictly inferior to the Yongwang in many ways, because of the fact that 1, you need 3 of them, whereas the Yongwang you only need 1. 2, the damage that the Fortune deals is significantly lower. Each of the shots, of which it only fires 3 of, does significantly less than the Yongwang. And the perk of the Fortune doesn't exist. It doesn't have a perk. The weapon's properties are the weapon's perks. The weapon's properties is it fires a wheel that rolls out on the battlefield, and then if it doesn't hit anything, it will explode after a short period of time. The blast radius of the Fortune is extremely small. The projectile speed of the Fortune is exceptionally high. And at super high power scores, where you're playing in CW, people already know how to ricochet their projectile velocity fused Fortunes off of the terrain to land perfect shots on the other side of the map. There are some crazy trick shots available with the Fortune. It's good on hovers, clearly. It's good on tracks. It's good on wheels. It's good in multiple power scores. In general, even though it is worse than Yangwang in many instances, it is still a very, very, very powerful weapon. Hitting someone with all of the Fortune shots is very, very, very strong. It's a very good weapon in those respects. Therefore, it is A tier. You're going to find it in CW. It's just extraordinarily good. The issue that it has is you're not going to find it in low power score at all, because a singular Fortune isn't enough, and multiple Fortunes is going to be pretty darned high power score. Next up is the Cyclone. Cyclone is a autocannon that has different properties than other autocannons. It does blast damage, same as most autocannons, but the difference between the Cyclone is it actually has a perk. The perk of the Cyclone makes it so the longer that you fire the Cyclone, the faster the Cyclone fires. So it basically picks up speed as you fire until it caps at a pretty dang good pace. This allows the Cyclone to clip through people. It means that people don't typically rush Cyclone players, because that's where the Cyclone's DPS is. It works very well with RN Seals. It works very well with the Favorite Cabin. It's got quite a wide range of power scores that you can actually end up seeing it in. It's pretty dang good when you see it. It's not bad in any way, shape, or form. The only problem is that it's not really useful in true long-range encounters, because usually at those encounters you're going to want to tap fire, and that works against its perk, but that doesn't really matter. That's not the strength of this weapon. The strength of this weapon is that it is a long-range chunker of a beast, and it's getting a new CK. For the CK alone, it would make it S tier, just kidding. But the Cyclone is a very strong autocannon. We're going to put it at A tier. Next is the M37 Piercer. The Piercer is the first rapid-fire machine gun on this list. It has no listed perk, and the reason why it has no listed perk is because the M37 Piercer was originally a rare. Moved to the special category. It does very, very good damage very, very quickly. That's all it does. It does suffer from projectile bloom, but even though that is the case, that doesn't really matter. The Piercers, you can actually tap fire at the Piercer just fine. You can use it on hovers just fine. Its damage is pretty high. It's a solid machine gun. Though you're not going to see it at extraordinarily high power scores, it does function in certain power score bands exceptionally well. So we're going to put it at B tier. Next is the Prometheus 5. Prometheus 5 is another plasma ball launcher. Prometheus 5, if I recall correctly, has the exact same perk, or a very similar perk to the Walts. Each progressive shot in the burst does more damage. So that means the last shot does more than the first shot on each burst. But that's it. Other than that, it doesn't really have any other perk. It's very similar to the synthesis at that regard. It is very good on hovers, but it's actually difficult to drag it outside of certain power scores. Since it doesn't really have a perk, it's just pure damage, and it's damage you have to lead your shots. It has all the same weaknesses of the synthesis. This brings it to C tier. You got to work your way around the use of the Prometheus in order to get it to work. You can, when combined with the power unit, do decent damage, but you're still working against yourself with this weapon. Next up is the Fafnir. Fafnir is just the upgraded junk bow. If I recall correctly, the perk of the Fafnir is that the faster you move before firing, the tighter the spread of the weapon. This is good. This is real good. It allows you to focus, strip off parts, do pass-bys, etc. Unfortunately, it falls in the same realm of the Parser. It falls behind the Parser, as does other weapons on this list. In fact, I'll cover that right now, which is the Nidhogg. The Nidhogg and the Parser. The Nidhogg falls shy of the Parser as well. It's one of those blast, instant shot, reload shotguns. But the problem, and the perk of the Nidhogg is the faster you move, the faster the reload speed. So you can get up to, I think, 40% reload speed on the Nidhogg based on movement speed, something like that, which is pretty good. But The only issue is it's directly facing it off against a parser, which can do more or less the same thing, but basically at longer, safer distances with more focused damage over the Nidhogg, and the Fafnir's accuracy bonus doesn't compare to the parsers either. But then again, it isn't epic and shouldn't. It's still a decent gun, and it will take you pretty far, but the Fafnir comes in at B tier, and so does the Nidhogg. Next up is the Aspect. The Aspect is very similar to the one, I think the first machine gun that we went over through on this list, which was the Spectre. The Aspect is an upgrade version of the Spectre. The Aspect is interesting because the hotter your gun, the more damage you deal. So what you want to do is have your guns nearly overheated, and that will increase the damage dealt by the weapon. An expert tapfire machine gun, expert at stripping off parts, can be exceptionally brutal to come across. It's a very good gun, sits definitely at A tier. Its only weakness is that there is a slightly better gun than it that exists. Next up is the Corvo. The Corvo is a very silly gun because of the fact it's a tapfire non-machine gun, because it is not automatic, where you fire 6 shots, but the last shot has a 200% bonus damage. So basically it's 8 shots per reload, but you only fire 6 shots to do it. The Corvo is interesting because it's very powerful, and when built towards, it is very, very strong. But in reality, you can easily get overwhelmed with the Corvo. The Corvo excels on hovers. You're just trying to keep your distance and shoot people's parts off. Hopefully they don't notice that you're using a reloading gun. And that's basically it. This thing is no better than necessarily any other machine gun at its job, except you basically need to use a reload module instead. It's not a bad gun, but it is somewhat niche in comparison to other machine guns, and very specific in the way that you have to play. And the counterplay is it's the exact same as all other machine guns. So because of that, it is a C tier, but a very high C tier. The R3739 adapter. This is a pulse accelerator gun, which means it is not energy. It does bullet damage, and because it's a pulse accelerator, it doesn't receive hit scan bonuses. The idea being this gun actually has projectiles very similarly to the Reaper, but it fires in bursts, and it reloads exceptionally fast. You do not require any modules to run the adapter, and that's the perk. Even though it doesn't have one listed, in reality the perk of the adapter is you don't need a reload module, and you don't need an RN seal. That said, if you do boost reload, this dramatically increases the DPS of the adapter. So if you use adapter combined with the Echo, then you end up with a reload that is so fast when the Echo perk is up that the DPS increases by about 25-30%. Very interesting, very specific. C tier. Next up is the infamous Retcher, one of the, if not the staple weapon of raids. The Retcher is the shotgun grenade launcher. Retchers are always a threat. Whenever you see them on the battlefield, you must strip them as soon as possible. Because unlike most weapons on this tier list, if someone can get behind you or get an engage on you with a Retcher, it doesn't matter what your build is. Your build no longer matters. It's very similar to the best weapon in the game, the Porcupine. Doesn't matter how you built your build. You're going to die. And you're going to die fast. Thankfully, there is a counter to the Retcher, and that is shooting it. Retchers have a very, very, very large hitbox, large and bulky hitbox. So it's actually very easy to get damage into these things, and they don't have very many hit points. So stripping a Retcher is easy, but you have to do it. If you don't do it, you're going to find your entire team dead because someone managed to get behind you and just blow everyone up. So it's a hit or miss weapon, but it's an exceptionally powerful one. In Leviathan Clan Wars, it is a staple. Every single Leviathan in existence uses Retchers. They are the most dangerous weapon on a Leviathan by far, and it is one of the primary focus points of them. When you get Retchers, interestingly enough, it's Retchers plural. A singular Retcher isn't that dangerous, but Retchers, when in plural, are a true threat and are most likely going to lose an entire game if the person who has them doesn't get stripped in a very short order. With that said, it's very difficult to rank this between S and A tier because it is definitely between S and A tier. I would definitely say that it's going to be an A tier, and the reason why is you don't see people seal clubbing with Retchers. That's not a thing. Retchers are too easily stripped. You can't hide them, or I'm sorry, you cannot present them on your build to defend your cabin. You can't do that because they'll just shoot your Retchers off. That's what they want to do. So they're going to do it, and that plays against the Retcher. Yeah, so because of that, you can't really bring them down from their power score, but in the power scores that they do work, they work very well. A very phenomenally strong gun. Possibly the strongest in the game, if not for the porcupine. Next up is the Little Boy. Little Boy is the first turreted cannon in the game, and it is a good one. It has a very, 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 very fast reload speed, surprisingly enough. Believe it or not, the Little Boy without a perk reloads about as fast as the Hulk with a perk. The only difference is its damage is lower, and its hit points are lower. It's got an excellent hitbox. Other than that, not much to say about it, other than the fact it follows turreted cannon mechanics, meaning it does 60% blast damage and 40% bullet damage. It's just by far and away just a generally good gun to have. You can get Little Boys, you can fuse Little Boys, they will take you pretty far, B tier. Next up is the AC-43 Rapier, the first autocannon in the game. Surprisingly, it is one of the better autocannons in the game because it is before you reach a power score where autocannons are just the worst. But therein lies the problem, because it cannot be dragged really anywhere outside of that very specific low power score band. Autocannons, it has bullet velocity. You have to lead your shots, even at close range, even at medium range. It has a slow turret traverse speed. It can be easily stripped from your build. It's not exceptionally good. When you end up, when you finally think you found a spot for the Rapier, you're going to find out that the places that the Rapier plays is actually not dominant. So if you play at long range, you're going to go up against true long range weapons, and they're going to outshine you 100%. If you go to mid range, again, mid range is going to outshine you, and at close range, you're completely helpless. So for that reason, the AC-43 Rapier is going into C tier. Next up is the Cricket. A very long time ago in a galaxy far away, the Cricket was one of the first S tier, if not the most S++ tier of weapons. For those of us who don't know, this is because of the fact the Cricket does extraordinary damage, and originally was the precursor on the build chain to the Retcher. And the Retcher, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't go over the Retcher's perk. The Retcher and the Cricket share a perk. It's very similar, which is that the further your opponent is from you, the more damage you deal. Full stop. So that means that if someone is 100+ meters away from you, you do more damage than if they're point blank range. This counteracts the idea of the fact that the Retcher and the Cricket both kind of shotgun their shots out, and they fan them out. So the idea is you're not going to hit with every shot at that distance, but when you do hit, you're going to do about the same damage, whether or not you're close or far. That's the counterplay. The Cricket fires a volley of 5 rockets. Each rocket does fairly good damage, and if you hit someone from across a map, you're going to strip parts. You're going to strip weapons. You're going to make their lives miserable. If they're at close range and you hit, you're going to hit with multiple rockets. So what's the problem with the Cricket? The Cricket has awkward geometry. Even though it looks like a cube, it's actually a little bit wider at the base. Secondly, the Cricket has horrible barrel. I'm sorry. Basically, you have to leave open such a wide path on your build to let your Cricket rockets out without flagging your build. The Cricket's going to be ultra vulnerable. The Cricket also has extraordinarily low hit points for its size. And then additionally, way back in the day, the Cricket used to fire all 5 shots in about, I'd say, 7.75 seconds. They made that extremely long. It basically takes nearly a second and a half or so for the Cricket to launch all of its rockets. Means that you have to be exposed to the enemy for a significant period of time to get those rockets off. Your opponent gets to move, and so on and so forth. This brings its efficacy down, which is unfortunate. It's an okay gun now. You can still make it work now, but in reality, the missile launchers on this list that fire their missiles faster, even though they fire smaller volleys, are even more effective, which brings this to B tier. Next up is the Boom. The Boom is a stick with a bomb on the front of it. You drive it into your opponent. That's all. It has no perk. It used to be a rare weapon. It is now a special tier. Honestly, this is outperformed by another weapon on this list. You don't really use them. You don't really see them for a reason. You can use them. We're going to put it in C tier. They aren't invalid, which is why they're going to C tier, but they aren't that good. We're going to shrink the list so we can see more because we've added so much more space. Moving on, we have the Buzzsaw. The Buzzsaw is the upgrade to the Borer. Originally, the Buzzsaw was rare tier, so as it is now a special tier, it has no perk. But the Buzzsaw does something interesting that most people do not know. The Buzzsaw has interesting geometry. It does melee damage on contact, just like the Borer, but the difference is the Buzzsaw has an entirely different hurt box. And the hurt box of the Buzzsaw actually extends beyond its impact points. So what this means is if it rams into your build, the blade is going to go further into your build physically and graphically, and that's where the hurt box is. So what this means is the buzzsaw is actually able and fully capable of damaging parts on the other side of parts, meaning it basically damages 2 pins, or can damage up to 2 pins at a time, giving it a minor penetrative quality. For that reason, it's actually pretty dang valid when used. The problem, other than that though, is its awkward geometry makes it difficult for you to maintain contact with your opponents. It's difficult to mount it horizontally or vertically because its narrow hurt box means that you now can no longer effectively damage someone's build, basically making these weird pros and cons with the buzzsaw. You can do some interesting stuff with the buzzsaw. You can make it so that if someone's mounting thin bumpers, you can damage the frame directly behind it. You can mess people up, but in reality, by the time the buzzsaw comes in, because of the fact that it has increased power score, you are well and truly into the power score bracket where the borer ceases to function well, and for all the reasons the borer ceases to function well, the buzzsaw actually kind of ceases to function there at all, because you will have less buzzsaws because of the fact that you'll be in a higher power score bracket. So this is still a B tier weapon, simply because of the fact that its awkward ability to penetrate past the first frontal pin to deal damage deep into someone's build can be used to great effect if used appropriately. Though if you come across people using shiv wheels and tracks and stuff like that, the buzzsaw is not going to be very useful at all, which is similar to the borer. So it's good in power score bands, but it struggles far outside of those. Next up is the Prosecutor 76mm. Way back in the day when the Prosecutor did not exist, it went directly from the Judge 76mm directly to the Executioner 88mm. The Prosecutor has a very fast reload for a linear cannon. Originally, the Prosecutor's perk, when released, was it penetrated 1 pin of structure, which was completely useless and did nothing. After Gaijin reevaluated it, Targum, Gaijin, whoever reevaluated it, they're like, okay, seeing as the perk presently it doesn't have one, which makes it worse than the Judge, we'll give it a perk. And they said it now also, just like the Executioner, penetrates 2 pins of structure. Second they did that, they obsoleted the Executioner, effectively. The Prosecutor fires faster, does all the same crit-seeking stuff the Executioner does, but again, fires just mo better, fires faster. That's all it takes. Its DPS is actually also higher simultaneously at a lower power score, which makes this a solid B-tier gun. Next up is the Judge 76mm, the very first linear cannon. Actually, that's not true. Let's cover the very first. That's the Avenger 57mm, the very first linear cannon, D tier. It is exceptionally bad. The DPS on the Avenger 57mm is very bad. Not only is the DPS bad, so too is the damage on hit. It's a very, very, very poor weapon, and it's limited on ammunition, and it's linear, and it's got all the same problems as explosive weapons. It's just, in general, poor. Now we'll move on to the Judge 76mm, which we tried to talk about a second ago. The Judge 76mm is very similar to the Prosecutor insofar as that it has a very fast reload speed, and then in addition to it having a very, sorry for dropping something there, in addition to it having a very fast reload speed, that is it. I was going to say in addition, but there is nothing else. It doesn't have a perk. However, in the power scores that you bring the Judge to, it's really, really good. It's actually really good. Even perkless, it's effective because at those power scores, people have so few hit points that it actually can keep up at B tier. But when when you start getting out of those power score bands, that's when the Prosecutor kicks in. And it actually gets difficult to drag the Judge too far out of the power scores that it is hyper effective in anyway. So that's fine. Next up is the Helios. The Helios is the third plasma ball launcher in the game, very similar to the Synthesis and Synthesis and Prometheus. But the difference is, unlike the Synthesis and Prometheus, it actually has a perk that's very, 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 very strong. The Helios' perk says that if you land all of your shots anywhere on your opponent's build, meaning all of the shots deal damage to their build, it will deal an additional bonus damage directly to their cabin. This is insane. This Helios, with this perk, it means that the Helios can fire on any part of your build and deal damage directly to your maximum life. This is exceptionally bad for tanky builds. This is exceptionally bad for seal clubbers. This is exceptionally bad for everyone. This is an exceptionally strong perk. Combine this with the reload booster from the power unit, and this thing can end up absolutely clapping people to death. A tier. Next up is the M38 Fidget. The M38 Fidget is the second rapid-fire machine gun on the list. It comes in after the M37 Piercer. Fidget's an interesting gun because it sits at the lowest hit points of any machine gun at its tier. This is very weird because it barely gains any hit points over the M37 Piercer. Beyond that, it does only like 5% more damage than the Piercer, like 3% more damage than the Piercer before it. so the damage isn't there. Okay, well, what's the perk of the fidget, though? Well, the perk of the fidget says that if you hit someone, the time to overheat the fidget increases. So long story short, if you stand and you burn someone down at point blank range, it's the equivalent of kind of having a radiator, additional radiator on your car. Ultimately, though, you can simply, you will simply already have radiators on your car. So the Piercer actually ends up better than the fidget because of the fact the fidget's power score hurts it exceptionally. The durability not increasing hurts it very badly because it starts operating in fights where your opponents are suddenly hitting a lot harder. So the fidget becomes far more easily stripped than the Piercer because of the difference between Piercer and the fidget's power score. So unfortunately, the fidget is a C tier weapon, even though it is one of my favorite weapons. It was my first purples in the game, one of my first epics. I loved it to death. I still have 4 of them, but unfortunately, they're too easily stripped and they don't bring enough to the table. Next up is the M39 Imp, the one that comes after the fidget. Very interesting thing here, the perk of the Imp is not overheat based. It's a simple perk that says every single rapid fire machine gun deals 5% more damage, period. And yes, this is stacks with itself. More imps, more damage, stacking all the way up to, of course, 25%. I'm sorry. Yeah, 25% if you mount 5 imps. You should never mount 5. Usually it's 4, so you have the 20% bonus on all imps that you have equipped, assuming you have 4 imps on your build. This gun is great. Unlike the fidget, the imp has great hit points. Unlike the fidget, the imp's perk is always effective. It's also great on Leviathans because of the fact that it has no spin up time. It's good when tap fired. It's got great DPS. It's just in general a very solid firearm. You need a lot of them to make them work, but they do work. That's an A tier gun. Next up is the CC-18 Typhoon. If this tier list were made, I don't know, maybe 6 to 8 weeks ago, the weapon would end up in an entirely different spot. But because of the fact that they tested the perk on the BC-17 Tsunami for 6 months before releasing it on the CC-18 Typhoon, it has the exact same shadow perk as the Tsunami, which is to say that the bullet damage that it deals, if it destroys a part, it moves the explosions closer to the center of your vehicle. The CC-8 Typhoon also has its own perk, which is effectively non-existent. If I recall correctly, the perk of the CC-8 Typhoon slows down reload and cooling speed for anyone hit. This was a big change from its original perk. The Typhoon's original perk actually basically turned off your car. And so what happened way back in the day, you would have 2 Typhoons, you'd fire one, hit them, you'd wait a second, and then hit them again while they're standing still, basically like extending the duration of them not being able to move for an entire second. It would be basically the equivalent of being hit with a spark or a flash, all of the stacks instantaneously instead of waiting for the charge up. This makes the CC-8 Typhoon exceptionally strong wherever it is brought, but due to its increased power score, it can't actually operate outside of certain power score bands. It is by far and away an upgrade to the Tsunami, but it isn't one where you typically try to seal club with it. You don't try and drag the Typhoon down that far. Though when it is dragged down, it is a threat exactly like the Tsunami is. Though the question is, for this ranking, is it more of a threat than the Tsunami when dragged down? I'd say it's about the exact same threat nowadays. Running around with Tsunami hovers, running around with Typhoon hovers down in 10k, which is just about as low as you can get them. The problem being you're going to be even less defended than someone running Tsunamis at the exact same tier, and they're going to do just a little bit better than you. But that doesn't mean that the Typhoon is not a genuine threat at those power scores, so we will give it an S tier. Next up is the Punisher. We're going to move that directly to S tier. Any place you see this gun, it is a pain. It hurts. It is the best machine gun in the game. It has 4 barrels, but it does not fire all 4 at the same time. It only fires 1 at a time. Punisher's perk says that after 40 consecutive hits or so, you just do like 100% bonus damage for like 10 seconds. The Punisher is insanely brutal. It strips guns better than any other gun stripper in the game. It is the quintessential tap fire machine gun. Unlike the other machine guns before it, it actually has a significant sum of hit points. It is the reason why the Reaper ends up so low on this tier list is because if you end up in a Reaper versus Punisher matchup, the Reaper will never do enough damage to the Punisher before the Punisher just punches the Reaper right off your build. It is the hit scanniest of hit scan weapons. It is well deserving of S tier. Anytime you see a Punisher, it is a genuine threat to you and your team. Next up is the Breaker. The Breaker is a shotgun that received a significant sum of nerfs because the Breaker was basically just too phenomenal. They nerfed every automatic shotgun, and that's when the Breaker basically got its back broken, air quotes. But in reality, it's actually just as good as it has ever been. The shotgun playstyle, which is the W key to win playstyle, is still exceptionally strong. At high power scores, it'll do just fine. The Breaker's perk says that when it would take damage that would destroy it, instead it is not destroyed and it becomes invulnerable for 1 second. That's insane when up against certain weapon types. So against Scorpions, against Typhoons, against Destructors, against things that do a significant sum of damage in one hit, the Breaker is remarkably good. However, this perk is almost useless against things that don't do damage in one hit, such as the Equalizer. Mind you, I'm only using Equalizer because that's already on the list, but the upcoming Aurora, things like that, because that invulnerability doesn't mean that it didn't take all the damage before that. So if someone's burning down your Breaker with an Aurora, and all of a sudden it goes invulnerable, well, after invulnerability ends, the Breaker is going to be at 1 hit point anyway. It's going to just get punched off your build. But against things like Scorpions, the Scorpion shot that destroys it does nothing. And it stays at the hit points it was at right before. So in those instances, the Breaker is very good against precision weapons. So phenomenal perk, but the problem is the Breaker is very impossible to make work outside of high power scores. So unfortunately, that leaves it at A tier. It's just takes so much power score to use that you can't bring it down very far. So it's only good in a very specific power score band, but it's very oppressive in the power score band that it's used in. In the power score band that's used in, it's got an oppression radius or ratio that's very high. Next up is the M29 Protector Front Machine Gun. And once again, I'm going to shrink the tier list again because it keeps getting larger and larger. The Protector Machine Gun is a front-facing machine gun, much like the Guardian and the Vindicator before it. The Protector is basically just a better version of the Tackler. It's basically a better version of the Guardian, I believe. Yeah, it's just in general a good machine gun. Nothing special to say about it other than the fact that, again, its perk is you shoot, and as you shoot and hit things, it gets more damage resistance. We're going to give it B tier, even though I don't necessarily like front-facing machine guns because they aren't exceptionally accurate. But, you know, a lot, as I said before, people who are better than I at the game claim these to be hyper effective. Next up is the AC62 Therm. The Therm is, in general, well, the Therm is an autocannon. It is very much just like its predecessor, the Jewel. Unfortunately, it does even less damage than the Jewel. It's fun. Let's be clear, the AC62 Therm is fun, but that's where the end of the Therm's abilities lie. The problem being that its damage is abysmal. Its damage was as low as 9. They increased it to 10 or 11. It doesn't matter. The damage is balls. Its accuracy is bad. It fires quickly, but that's all it's got going for it. It's going to put up large numbers, which is fun. Once again, fun. But just because you see large numbers doesn't mean that you're being very effective. It's splashing that little tiny bit of damage all over your opponent's build. Its splash radius isn't wide enough to get through a gun mount. It's just, unfortunately, not very effective. And so it sits at D tier. Next up is the Ripper, the Relic Ripper. This is going to get a buff in the upcoming pass of balance changes, which is good. It kind of needs it. It's a fun gun. So what the Ripper does currently, I'll explain. It is a fixed weapon. It is front-facing, meaning that it's obviously not a turret and can't rotate 360 degrees. Upcoming balance changes say that it will be able to rotate 360 degrees, and they're increasing the turn velocity of the weapon. So that's good. They're also increasing the damage that is dealt from the blades after they've landed. All of these things said and done, the Ripper does 100 damage per blade, fires 3 blades per. So this thing does actually hit harder than a Scorpion, but only at point blank range. Over any distance, or any real distance, the Ripper is not very good. You're gonna do damage, but it's not gonna be good. It just isn't. Thankfully, it doesn't lose damage over distance, so it will maintain its damage. But because of the fact that the blades will be so wide and far apart, that unless you're firing at a very large build, it's not really going to do very well. After the change, the projectiles will stay on their targets longer, or on the ground longer, and they're going to do double the damage that they deal right now. But in reality, with the power scores that you're going to be playing at the Ripper at, you're not going to be up against specifically just ground vehicles. You're going to be up against things like, oh, I don't know, hovers. So the Ripper is fun. The Ripper does do boatloads of damage, but you have to play around everything that it does, and it creates a really silly play style, whereas everyone else is just going to W key and shoot you. So we're going to put that at C tier. Next up is the Hulk. The Hulk is very much like the Fat Man and the Little Boy because it sits in between, but unlike the Fat Man and the Little Boy, this thing just stomps. It is extraordinarily oppressive in the power scores that is brought in. Its damage is higher than that of the Little Boy, and its reload is just as fast. It's got everything that a growing boy needs for the power scores that it's in. It is oppressive. A tier. Its perk is that when you hit someone, it simply reloads the gun a little faster. And that's all it takes. You combine this with an echo, and you bully people down. You just W key at them, and you spam left mouse button watching them cry because they can't remove your Hulks fast enough, and you just keep going boom, 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 boom. It's dumb. This bullied arenas. It bullies low power score, bullies mid power score. Hulks are just an exceptionally good gun. You can even fuse them. They're not bad. Next up is the Hurricane, my most hated weapon in this game. I hate the Hurricane. It is the longest range weapon in the game, effectively. I'll tell you guys a couple things about it, such as people who are very good with this weapon make playing Crossout in open maps torture. It's bloody effing torture. You can mount them facing up, which you shouldn't, or you can mount them facing forward or backwards. In reality, you should mount them forward or backwards because the idea is this allows you to do all sorts of things. Firing the Hurricane directly at your opponent means that it takes the most direct path to get to them. Your missiles will take the most direct path, and that can be good. But what's really insane is mounting them facing backwards or firing your Hurricanes away from your opponent. Because of the way the Hurricane works, for whatever reason, it will fly a super wide arc straight in the air, and then after flying for about 1.5 seconds, it will then make a 90-degree arc and just instantly directly fly at your opponent. This is insanely brutal for ultra long range. If you're ultra long range away from someone with a Hurricane, they're going to kill you. The only true counter to the Hurricane is getting close, and they're going to fly away from you. It is an annoying playstyle. It is remarkably frustrating to play against. It isn't seen in CW. It isn't seen in any competitive sense. It's just remarkably annoying and remarkably trolly, but it functions. And if you build a build that specifically goes towards the Hurricane's strengths, the Hurricane can get you a lot of kills. But unfortunately, it doesn't change counterplay, and the counterplay is hyper effective against it, which is the W key. We're going to go with C tier. Next up is the MG14 Arbiter, another minigun on the list that completely outperforms the Reaper. The Arbiter is a hit scan weapon. It works exactly like the Equalizer, but the difference between the Equalizer and the Arbiter is the perk stacks higher, the base damage is higher, and that is all. It's just higher damage, more durability, better weapon. That's all. It synergizes absolutely perfectly with the Aurora for mid-range, and unlike the Equalizer, it is perfectly valid if you just bring 4 Arbiters. The Arbiter build allows you to try to whittle down your opponents at long range. It is good at stripping weapons. It's just, in general, a good gun for those people who are very good at precision fire. It operates very well in and out of its power scores. It even operates well in CW. The only downside is it's not necessarily a super mega threat that you absolutely have to get rid of whenever you enter a power score bracket. It's not like, oh no, this person has Arbiters, we have to focus them. It's hard to counter. In reality, the Arbiters are fairly easily stripped off by shotguns and things like that at point blank range, but it will do a fair bit of stripping on its own. That is an A tier weapon. Next up is the Pulsar. Pulsar is very similar to the Quasar because it is the evolved version of that. Pulsar's perk is the blast radius of the weapon increases based on distance from the target. If you hit someone at 300 meters with this weapon, expect to see big numbers. Basically, the blast radius will encompass their entire build at about 7 pins wide diameter. It's a very, 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 very fun weapon, just like the Quasar. And you can also use it for seal clubbing. It's useful with armor. You put the pulsars directly in front of your build. It's excellent on hovers. It's pretty dang good at just about any range it's brought into. But you don't see them used a lot anymore. I'm not sure 100% sure why, honestly. If used with reload modules, if used with the Hadron, pulsars could probably be a majorly annoying threat on the battlefield. Honestly, I don't know why they're not seen as often, other than the fact that their reload is kind of brutal, so their DPS is low. They don't do enough damage to break a Nova Shield, which, believe it or not, is a good thing. So that actually brings it up, because if you don't break a Nova Shield, it doesn't matter if they timed it correctly or not. They'll block your shot, and it doesn't matter. now they're on a like 20+ second cooldown and you're not. So the Pulsar actually has some very interesting counterplay. I'd say it's mid to low A tier. Next up is the Blockchain. Blockchain is a remarkably brutal weapon. I'll try and cover what it does. The perk of the Blockchain is, think of the Blockchain like an energy cannon that doesn't do blast damage. It just does instantaneous damage. The perk of the Blockchain is that structural parts, those that have damage pass-through, do not allow their damage pass-through to function at maximum efficacy. Instead of 90% pass-through, the pass-through is cut down, all the way down, to 75%. That doesn't sound like much until you realize that the entire reason why pass-through parts have any appreciable amount of hit points is 100% because of the pass-through. And that means that one Blockchain can actually remove, in one hit, provided you have a 5% damage bonus from Jade or some other source like that, or just fuse Blockchains for damage, in one hit can remove a gun mount, which is the most powerful structural part. That's 380 potential hit points of durability lost in one shot. The Blockchain is interesting, but not a lot of people have it because it is a sideways laser that looks like a very wide laser, and it actually is not. It is actually 8 lasers all firing at the exact same time, each adjacent to each other. What this means is that if you vertically mount a Blockchain, you actually have a vertical line, and if you horizontally mount a Blockchain, you have a horizontal line. And almost always, in all circumstances, should you mount your Blockchains horizontally. Because if you have it vertically mounted, this means that the 8 lasers will have almost a 0% chance of hitting things such as frame. So, with that said, you can deframe people, you can strip apart hovers, you can do some insane stuff, but the Blockchain is heavily limited because of the fact that its range, while it is good, isn't the best. If you fuse Blockchains for bonus range, you're going to do a lot of hurt, and a lot of people are going to be very mad at you, and you can destroy a lot of hovers with them. Other than that, I don't think there's very much to say more about the Blockchain other than the fact that because of the fact that it's 8 individual beams, it actually can penetrate or seem to penetrate as far as the beam allows, honestly, into someone's build. If they have a bunch of structural parts in their build, it doesn't even matter. You can punch from the very front to the very back of their build in one shot, basically severing them from everything they hold dear in life. It's actually pretty interesting. So Blockchain is a very interesting anti-hover weapon, especially considering it is absolutely hit scan. But the problem with problems with Blockchain are that its geometry make it very difficult to build with. Very, very difficult to build with, if not nearly impossible to protect. Extraordinarily oppressive weapon when used aggressively against those who are remarkably weak against it. Surprisingly, the Blockchain's greatest weakness is high durability. Striking opponents that have high durability parts on their build with the Blockchain will feel very ineffective. Striking people who use pass-through parts like dogs and hovers will make you feel like they're not even using a build. You can remove them from their frame, you can remove them from their weapons, you can remove them from the game very, very rapidly. For those reasons, the Blockchain is going into B tier. It is not something that you see in CW, it's not something that you see in specific power bands. It's a fun weapon when used, though. It does produce results, but it's not producing results at the rate that you need it to in order to keep up. Next up is the trigger. The trigger was released at the exact same time as the Blockchain. The trigger works very, very, very similarly to the Destructor because the Destructor copied the trigger. The trigger fires a laser beam that overheats its target, and then after a certain period of time, it will do a pulse of damage that will do, I think it does like 50 damage at the very end. The real interesting thing here is, unlike the Destructor, you do not need to hit with the entire beam in order to get that pulse. The trigger will always deal that pulse damage at the very end. The trigger is great and would rank pretty dang high on this list if it weren't for the fact that its range is abysmal. It is a medium to close range weapon, right about where shotguns start to dominate the meta, and that hurts the trigger very badly. Though, when used properly, you can strip people, you can do a lot of damage, but the problem is that it's really operating in a space that it shouldn't, and it doesn't do that well because of the fact that even when it's fused for range, it doesn't shoot necessarily far enough. Very powerful. Very good for dealing high damage, but you got to change the way you play, not necessarily how people play against you. Next up is the Mace, the man, the myth, the legend. The Mace shotgun is broken. It's just busted. Take everything that we were talking about, the Lupara and the Sledgehammer, and then add a perk. That's it. It doesn't even take more energy than the Lupara, and it doesn't take more energy than the Sledgehammer. You don't even need it. So if you're looking to bully low power scores and you wish to dominate a very basically wide bracket of things, you're probably looking to use the Mace. Normally I would put the Mace, no, definitely. Yeah, no. The Mace sits next to the Goblin at S tier. It's just a gun that outperforms. It is a true threat wherever you see it. You're going to bully any power score that you can get it into. head to head, you lose almost every single match up against the mace. If someone with 4 maces manages to just ram you from the side, there's almost nothing you can do. Like, even if your guns are ready and you immediately spin your guns around to start firing at them, you're done. The mace is exceptionally brutal. It's just like the sledgehammer. It's just very good, and it allows you to reach up into slightly higher power scores than that. Thankfully, the mace's power score is low enough that even if you were going quad mace, it doesn't drag you into power scores where the mace is ineffective. It's generally a true threat. It's kind of busted, actually. That hitbox, the hitbox of the mace, the hitbox of the sledgehammer, and the hitbox of Lupara make these guns insanely difficult to remove. Their mass makes them insanely easy to get on builds as well. Next up is the AD-12 Hawk Perkless. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't go over the perk of the mace. Perk of the mace says that every 100 meters that you travel, you increase the damage of your next shot. It stacks up to 4 times. Though, when fully stacked, it still does less damage than the Thunderbolt, and it takes longer to stack than the Thunderbolt. AD-12 Hawk. This is a drone. It's one of the hover drones. The Hawk shoots bullets down, and we'll just cover the Hawk and the Falcon right now. They are interesting because at low power scores, if you're able to drive around with the Hawk and the Falcon, you can actually put in some interesting work. But in reality, there's no place outside of extremely low power scores that you're going to get much use out of these weapons. So we're going to put... and you can be shut down, actually, believe it or not, at lowest power scores. We're going to put the AD Falcon at D tier, and there's a reason. Because of the fact that you end up landing at such low power scores with the Falcon, you end up where everyone has machine guns. And machine guns are the hard counter to the Falcon. They just shoot your drone down. The Hawk, you end up in such slightly higher power scores where people are testing other weapons. And so you end up in a situation where not everyone has machine guns to shoot down your drones. So the Hawk is C tier, whereas the Falcon is D tier. Next up is the Annihilator. It's another drone, the highest tier drone, legendary drone. The Annihilator has a perk where the drones that are launched that you control, unlike the previous drones, you can choose who the Annihilator drones track and shoot. When these were released, they were the most powerful things in the entire video game and would have ranked S+++++++ tier, if not for the fact that Gaijin nerfed the crappy crap out of them. Originally, they never stopped moving. They could dodge fire in midair. They had over 100-something plus hit points, so they were very difficult to damage. Even with hit scan weapons, you couldn't shoot them. They were a pain. They were literally annihilators. They would definitely win any match quite brutally. However, nowadays they made the hitbox of the drone larger. They reduced the hit points. They made it so it stands still when it attacks, so that way it's not impossible to do anything to. Lots of good changes to bring the Annihilator down. The Annihilator is what's known as a feast or famine weapon. Feast, if you end up in a match against opponents who have no ability to shoot down your Annihilators, you will wipe the board. If you've ever been against people who bring Annihilators, it can be remarkably brutal. If you have cannons or shotguns or summiters or crossbows, and all of a sudden some dick with like freaking Annihilators runs in and just starts, sending his Annihilators after you, and it's very impossible for you to do anything about those Annihilators. And additionally, unlike every other drone on this list, the Annihilator has a unique feature. You can launch your drones and then go invisible, and then direct your drones to attack while still invisible. This provides you a significant sum of abilities to do stuff where you can just follow someone around completely invisible, hide behind objects. They never know where you are, and they have to deal with your drones. And if they don't have the ability to shoot down your drones, for example, as I said, they're using linear cannons or they're using grenade launchers or skinners, and they can't shoot your drones down, well, then they just die. The Annihilator perk, as I said, I may have mentioned, I'll go over this again because I don't think I mentioned it. The perk of the Annihilator is the drones themselves stack a debuff on you almost identical to the Spark, draining cabin power. So anybody hit by the Annihilator drones is slowed down too. It's really crazy. They will pick you apart very, very slowly. Death by 1,000 cuts. They are the highest ranking drone on this list, but it's feast or famine. It truly is. And the reason why they're going to rank higher than you think I'm going to put them is because of the fact that they are actually good as an accessory. If they aren't used as your primary weapons, so for example, let's say you have one Annihilator backing you up, it actually ends up being more useful than having multiple Annihilators. Because of the fact that you can do things like you can slow down a singular opponent who's trying to get away from you with an Annihilator drone and then crash into them with melee. This is very similar to the Spark, But the difference is you can do it at farther ranges because you can launch your drone and send it out over a range, so now they can't get away. And so now they're forced to engage your harvester and things like that. So because of the fact that it still triggers a harvester, because of the fact that there is interesting counterplay and all that stuff like that, we'll give it B tier, but that's the highest a drone will ever rank on this list. Next up is the DT Python. The DT Python is sweating it out because he's like, wait, what? That's the highest that he's going to rank on the list? That is correct, DT Python. That is correct. I'm sorry, this is not a DT Python. This is a, I'm sorry, the DT Python is already on the list. Somehow this is just here 2 times. We're going to skip to the next weapon. That next weapon is the ATGM flute, which stands for air-to-ground missile flute. The ATGM flute is the evolved version, if not the upgraded version of what the clarinet toe is supposed to be. They're missiles that you as the player control. You fly them by laser, not by wire, and that means that you can do crazy stuff. I'll explain that in a moment. But the perk of the ATGM flute is as follows. After launch, the damage that the flute does is increased for every second that it's out. So the longer that the flute exists, the more damage it deals if you hit someone with it, which can be insane. What you do with the flute is you fire the shot, aim straight up, and then hold down the weapon lock key so the missiles fly straight up. Then you find a target, you point at them with the lasers, and they come basically straight down on your opponent. The flute is a very interesting weapon in that regards. Other than that, it's basically just a better pyre. For multiple reasons, though it does not synergize at all with the dust cabin because the dust cabin will reduce the duration of the flight time of any missiles attached. Also, I don't think it even affects the flute. But anyway, other than that, the flute is basically a better pyre. You can get pretty far with flutes. You can do a lot of damage with flutes. You can actually, there are some super crazy things you can do. Some of the best players I've seen don't even need a line of sight to their opponents to hit them with the flutes. You launch the flutes directly at, like off to the side of the cover that your opponent's hiding behind. And then at the very last second, you mouse over the cover and then the flutes whip around the cover and hit your opponents. Crazy stuff. You can do like trick shots with the flutes. So all that said, the damage is good. The perk is good. It is super viable. B tier. Next up is the AC-50 Storm, which is probably the best of the middle-of-the-road autocannons. Definitely better than the Whirlwind, definitely better than the Rapier. The difference between this and the Rapier is that it actually has a perk. The further away from your target, the more damage it deals. The problem is that it doesn't really keep up after that. It is better than the Rapier, but it is still a C-tier weapon. Autocannons don't rank very high for a good reason, and it doesn't rank very high for this reason. It's the best of the supposedly long-range autocannons, but even the best isn't that very good. Next up is the Pyralid. The Pyralid is the weaker version of the Locust, and as such, it functions exactly like the Locust. It fires 2 rockets just like the Locust and just like the Wasp, has the same perk. If you hit with both of them, the next explosions or the next rockets you fire have an increased blast. If you hit with both of those, then that will just keep chaining continuously. Pyralid's power score is fine. Basically, if you don't have Locusts, you can get Pyralids. But they don't take you, but they're not near, they don't do as much damage as the Locust. But ultimately it does basically the exact same thing. And as such, it's going to go into B tier. You might be wondering, why is it B tier? And here's the reason why. The power score increase over the Wasp doesn't necessarily justify it. It's perk. And a lot of people still use the Wasp over the Pyralid, because of the fact that the Wasp really fires faster. The speed that you get your Wasps back allows you to put down a field of fire much better than the Pyralid, and the power score increase doesn't necessarily equate the damage buff that you're getting out of that. Next up is the Whirl. The Whirl autocannon is phenomenal. It is, as I say these words, I think, double checking with my brain, the best autocannon. Yeah, my brain says it's the best autocannon. It is. Basically, it falls into the standard W key playstyle. It bullies a lot of people in a lot of different power scores. It really shouldn't. But it does. When combined with the appropriate builds, it does exceptionally well. When not combined with the appropriate builds, it's still pretty decent. You typically want to, it's the first autocannon that you actually want to be a true dog with. You want to be the aggressor, you want to get in there, you want to deal damage, and the Whirl is great at it. The perk of the Whirl says that if you have 2 or more enemies within 30 meters of you, you just do 30% more damage. It's that simple. So you want to be in the middle of things. You want to combine this with the Howl. You want to combine this with the Humpback. You want to get all up in their stuff, and you want to hold down left mouse button super hard. The only downside would be that... No, actually, I'm trying to determine whether or not this is A or S tier as I'm saying this. I'm pretty sure that's going to be an S tier weapon. It's a true threat. No matter where you see this damn thing, it is a true threat. It truly brings the heat. There really isn't a very good counter to it. If they get in, they get in. You pretty much have to take them out before they get to you. But if they get to you, it's rough. It's rough. The Whirl is a really good autocannon. Also, hit point density comes into play here. The Whirl actually has the second highest hit points of any autocannon right now, and actually has more hit points than the AC-80 Stillwind. It's silly. And it has a smaller hitbox. So, there you go. Next up is the Toadfish. Crossbow fires 2 shots. Its perk is if you hit with both, the impulse is ridiculously increased. If you've ever wanted to team rocket someone, hit them high on their build with a Toadfish on that second shot with multiple Toadfishes and watch them just disappear. The Toadfish is a sniper weapon because of that, it has one of the smallest projectiles in the game. If not, it's tied for the smallest projectile in the game. It's a good gun. What can I say? The only downside is it's not as accurate as the Spike. Because its crosshair its crosshair and its bloom is just greater. So while it functions like a sniper weapon, it's not a super true sniper weapon. It's mid-long range. It's a very specific range that it suddenly exists in, which is weird. But other than that, it works on Leviathans for Levy C-Dub. I just realized I have to shrink this again because the list is getting so large. So, yeah, no, Toadfish is just a solid weapon. Can be used in a lot of different situations. It deals decent damage because of the fact it fires 2 times, but each individual shot will do less than a Spike. Just want to put that out there. So we're going to put this into B tier. Next up is the Arathron. This is the lowest ranking shotgun on the list simply because of the fact that it tries to do something differently. Every other shotgun does the same thing. Get in, deal damage. The Arathron is like get kinda in, but don't get too close. Deal damage unless they're too far away. Its perk is silly. Long story short, anyone who's played Overwatch who knows Roadhog knows the alternate fire of his shotgun. This is the alternate fire of that shotgun, except it's every single shot. You shoot the gun, it fires a ball of damage out. If it hits before it explodes or detonates, there's not an actual explosion. If it hits before it breaks apart, then the damage is lower than if it breaks apart. If the damage breaks apart and someone's at that exact tip, the tip of the knife as it explodes, it does boatloads of damage. But other than that, the Arathron is very difficult to use. You can get very good with the Arathron, but you have to work very hard to get those results. That's a C tier weapon. Next up is the King. King is a mine layer, and as a mine layer, it's... I don't want to say brain dead because the fact it's not brain dead. You have to work pretty dang hard to make the King function. I guess the best way to put it would be... I don't think the King has a perk. If I recall correctly, the King just drops mines that detonate after someone drives near them. Getting these mines under someone's build can be a pain. You can lock down lanes of ingress against you. The most common way to use the King mine layer is with the Skinner. You skin people, you hook them onto you, and you just drag them through your mines. You create a minefield, and you just drag people over those things. That is exceptionally brutal. It is a very specific play to play, but when you do get that down, you actually are very hyper-effective. The King can be hyper-effective in many other situations. You can bring it as an accoutrement onto other builds. Obviously, it's used with the Hadron. The damage is phenomenal. It's used in CW. It's a pretty darn annoying thing in wherever it's brought. We're going to give it A tier. When brought anywhere, it's really annoying. By the way, even though this says DT Python, I just realized why that is, and we're going to go over this right now. This is the sidekick. Sorry about that. So we're going to say the sidekick, and we're just going to put it over here next to the other DT Python thing on the list. This is sidekick. One of these is sidekick. One of these is DT Python. It doesn't matter which one is which. They are both C tier. The sidekick creates a drone. It is not a turret. The sidekick drives around and it shoots. It does basically it. That's it. There's no perk. It just drives around and it shoots. Sidekick is terrible, honestly. You can make sidekicks work just like you can make other things work, but in reality, you don't want to rely on them. Actually, I don't want to do this because it's difficult to see which one of these is which. I'm pretty sure this is the turret and this one's the sidekick. We're going to put it in D tier. The reason why we're dragging it down is because the fact that it moves, it's going to get underneath your allies. It always blocks. It's not going to do very much damage. Its damage is actually lower than the next weapon on the list, which is the Grenadier. It's another drone. Yeah. And it won't always shoot. You need a radar on your build to make them function. Crazy stuff. We're going to go to the Grenadier, and that one will be the final drone at C tier. It's annoying. The Grenadier, when it locks onto its opponents, a long time ago, there was a time when the grenade drones were the weapon of Crossout. Drone apocalypse, as it were. Grenade drones would follow you no matter where you went. They didn't require anything. You just launched them and you just laughed as your drones went out and just killed everyone in the opposing team. They fixed that. They made it so that if you get too far away from your drones, they are going to come back and wrap around to you. And because they fixed that, that makes grenades very difficult to use. You don't want to break a line of sight between your drone and your opponent, so you don't want to pass between your opponent and your drone. You'll intercept shots. You'll break their line of sight. They'll choose different targets. It's dumb. It's frustrating. Grenades they're basically worse than they used to be. They're still annoying to play against, but they are worse than they used to be. The drones themselves can simply be shot down. People will simply follow you to wherever you go and blow you up. If they have a counter to your build, which is to say any hit scan weapon, you're done. Your weapons aren't going to work. If you reach end game, which is to say it's just you versus one other person and they can shoot your drones, you can't do anything. Unfortunately, to make grenade drones work or the DT Python work, you have to work very, very, very hard, and you're not going to be getting very much out of that. The elephant is the next weapon, very, very, very similar to the Fat Man. The difference is the elephant does less damage, but has a higher projectile velocity. The elephant is one of the more expensive weapons. The perk of the elephant is that while it is reloading, it has damage reduction, so it actually has even more hit points. So it's a super tanky Fat Man that actually has a higher projectile velocity. It's a fun gun, but its damage lacks. It actually has some. When actually used, its damage just isn't there. So because of the fact the damage just isn't there, because of the fact that it takes much longer to reload than the Fat Man is already on a downward trend from the Hulk. Unfortunately, the elephant is also C tier. It's difficult to bring it to bear. Hilarious. Animal puns. Next up is the Remedy. The Remedy is the weakest flame weapon. Its damage is abysmal. It doesn't have a perk, just like the other flame weapons. The perk of them is that it fires flame and that flame overheats targets. That is the perk. It has the same fire rate as the Draco, but its damage is exceptionally bad. Before they nerfed the Draco's damage, and even after they nerfed the Draco's damage, a Remedy being buffed by the Blight Cabin does less damage than a Draco being buffed by nothing. That just tells you how bad the Remedy base is. When combined with the Blight, it is passable, but it must be combined with the Blight in order to function. It does do heating of parts. With that said, it is a interesting, decent introduction to flame weapons. Try not to drag it too far out of the tier that it's in, its power score that it's in, because it does not function there. People will try to drag the Remedy up into Clan Wars because they're like, I got a flame weapon. No, you don't. So it's B tier. Next up is the sorry about that. If it's your only gun and you're trying to do CW and you're the fire dog, I understand why you're using the Remedy. I'm not dogging on you, but you're not bringing the heat, as it were. Next is the STM-23 Defender. That is a front-facing machine gun, the lowest tier of the front-facing machine guns. If I recall correctly, the Defender works exactly like all the other machine guns. It works just like them, but the only downside is it has no perk, doesn't even have a defense perk, and it isn't very accurate. If you fire for too long with the front-facing machine guns, and by too long I mean after 3 bullets, the 3rd bullet or the 4th bullet is just way off center, so you're just never landing precise shots with these guns. I don't want to say too much, but I'm just trying to think if there's anything of note other than that. I think that when you compare it to other weapons of the same tier, it functions basically about as well. So this is a B tier weapon. Next up is the MD3 Owl. The Owl works almost exactly like the RT Anaconda, which is to say, unlike the RT Anaconda, which is a turret that sticks to the ground and launches a rocket, the Owl is a drone that flies around you that fires a rocket. And that's all. There's no perk. So you might ask, why? Well, where does it land? And the answer to that is it's going to land into C tier. You can make this work, and it's a better weapon than the RT Anaconda because you're not limited by terrain as badly, because the fact that you're higher up, it means that the rockets are coming down to hit their opponents, and that alone increases it to C tier. But it is not a good weapon. It is not something you want to necessarily build everything around. Next up is the Assembler. The Assembler is a sniping weapon, though the downside the Assembler has with being a sniping weapon is projectile size. Even though it's supposed to be a sniping weapon, much like crossbows, much like the median, its projectile size is basically that of a telephone pole. The Assembler's perk if it has one, is that you overcharge it. It is a negative press weapon. You have to overcharge it to fire. Once charged to 100%, it will do full damage, but here's the kicker. You can overcharge it beyond that, and as you overcharge it, it will do an increased damage beyond that, up to 300 potential damage, which I've never been able to successfully do, which is at the point that it overheats. You have to release it before it overheats. If it overheats, then the weapon literally overheats. And much like the Gravistar, it sets itself to 100% heat, making itself very easy to strip. There is no upside to it overheating. You do not want it to overheat. You want to make sure that you get that shot off right before the overheat. The assembler also is very interesting because you don't have to charge it at all, and you can tap fire it. It fires these extremely slow-moving and extraordinarily weak balls of electric energy that do almost nothing and are never used by anyone because they don't do anything. So this is basically just a true sniper weapon. And for true snipers, the assembler is actually pretty annoying to play against. People bring the assembler into low power scores and then slap people from across the map because people with low power scores don't necessarily know how to deal with it. It has a flat arc trajectory. It doesn't have projectile drop like the crossbows or the medians, but it fires like the Scorpion insofar as that it will travel straight. The more charged it is, the faster the shot goes as well. The problem is it's not a good gun because its DPS is exceptionally low. You gotta try really hard to get something out of this gun. So unfortunately, the assembler is going into C tier. Next up is the Lancelot. Lancelot is just like the Boom. Boom was ranked in C tier because it's just not that good, whereas Lancelot is being ranked in A tier because it is that good. Lancelots are annoying. They work just like the Booms. You want to crash them into your opponent, but they kind of have a perk, and that perk is more damage faster you go. So if you're moving fast as you hit them, they die. Full stop. Also, the Lancelots seem to have their own perk that you don't know, which is they don't seem to take blast damage from Lancelots that go off next to them, which is really useful. It means that you don't damage yourself with your own Lancelots, which is to say that a Lancelot or a Boom isn't going to go off and then remove all of your own weapons. That's a good thing. What will end up happening is a Lancelot will go off and only damage your opponent, even if there's a Lance right next to it. If you build with Lancelots or Booms, what you want to do is build them staggered. You don't want them all to impact at the same time. You want them to impact iteratively. So you have basically you have a large arrow on the front of your build, or at least multiple different points, so they all land at different times. So you don't waste every last one of your Lancelots in the same guy. Other than that, the gameplay style is annoying and boring and stupid, but it is very effective, and when it works, and it's quite frustrating to immediately have someone lose their entire build, half their build, or two people lose half their build. It's really, really annoying. And it's also basically an unmissing thing because of the fact you're not going to miss. The LM54 Cord is the next weapon on the list. Holy crap, I probably should have started with this. This is a basic weapon. Everyone's going to use it. It's the upgrade to the Hornet, which is the starting gun of the game, which I actually forgot to put up here. Sorry about that. Starting gun of the game and the LM54 Cord are both D-tier guns. They are garbage. They are tap-fire machine guns, but the problem with these weapons is that they don't do any damage whatsoever. You can fit a boatload of cords on your car. You can, but even a boatload of them isn't going to do any damage. And that is the weakness of the LM54 Cord. They're easily stripped. They're not like the Lupara, which can do hundreds. They are very, 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 very bad. Just upgrade off of your cords, upgrade off of your Hornets as soon as you can. Nothing more to say about that. Next up is the Fuse. The Fuse drone is one of the most annoying freaking weapons in all of Crossout because it is a drone, and the only thing that you do with the Fuse is you stand at the edge of the periphery of combat and you just launch drones. You use the Harpy cabin or you use the Tusk cabin, and to make sure people stay at a standoff distance from you. You may bring boosters, you may not, and you just drive along and you just launch Fuse drones. It is one of the most annoying things to fight against in Crossout. It sucks. It genuinely sucks, and I hate it. The problem is it's effective. Unlike other drones where a hard counter is hit scan weapons, the hard counter is, while it is hit scan weapons, if you don't destroy the drones fast enough and you blow them up right next to you, you just get blown up. So you really need to be on point shooting down these effing Fuse drones. And if you're not, they're just going to come and get you. Unlike other drones, by the way, Fuse drones, once they get a lock, they're going to follow you to the end of time. So for example, if you have a Grenader drone, the Grenader drone will come back to you if someone passes outside of the range of the drone. Fuse drones just keep waiting until they find someone, and they will follow you all the way back to your damn garage. They're a remarkably frustrating weapon to fight against, and they are actually effective when used. And that's basically it. Though you're not going to see them in super high power scores because their efficacy dramatically wanes when people have real builds, and so for that reason, it goes into C tier. Yeah. Next up is the trombone. I said when this thing came out that it wasn't going to be that good, and I was right. Just kidding. I did say that it wasn't going to be that good because its damage was non-existent, though it exists solely and only to overheat your opponents. And as such, that is remarkably annoying. The devs have said that the trombone needs to be patched and nerfed in a slight way. The only way that I would suggest the trombone be nerfed is to have it function exactly like pyres and exactly like hurricanes and everything else, where if you don't have a lock on someone, you can't fire it. That way people would, waste ammunition on the trombone. Right now, you cannot waste ammunition on the trombone. If the weapon fires, it means you had a lock. The end. And that's a little bit overpowered in comparison to other missile weapons. Other than that, the trombone provides only heating, and that is it. It does very minuscule damage, and that is all. It creates a large annoyance with missile locks and all the other crazy stuff like that. So for those reasons, because it's disruptive to everyone's gameplay, it's going to go into S tier. It's used in basically every tier. You basically want to kill someone who has got trombones as soon as possible, only because of the fact it's really annoying. It's not especially effective. You're going to find a lot of people who love their meme trombone builds, where it's just them and 6 trombones launching missiles at every opponent. They map every trombone to a different weapon, so everyone constantly is being affected by the missile lock warning. But that is not as effective as simply playing with concentrated damage in mind to focus on someone who actually should be targeted, things like that. 1 second. Had to resize the tier list again. Thankfully, I think for the very last time. We're almost done. Next up is the Astraeus. Interesting story about the Astraeus. I would normally have given this thing either D or C tier because of it is just genuine balls. But the reason why let's just place it where it is right now. Right now, it's a D tier weapon. It really functions very poorly. It fires telephone poles downstream. Its perk is also non-existent. It works exactly like the assembler. You charge it, you overheat, you deal more damage. It doesn't overheat, but instead when fully charged, it deals damage to the things that it is mounted to, dealing damage to you and your build. The problem with this is that you can put this on mountings, but then the mountings get destroyed, and then people will say, wait a minute, you can use the master cabin. If you're trying to counteract your own perk with the perk of another thing that is also terrible, you already effed up. You could have just simply used a good build. The Astraeus is exceptionally bad in that regard presently. People want to make it work. Good luck with that. It fires at a flat trajectory, etc. Now, with that said, with its current placement at D, it's going to be upgraded in the next patch. They're saying that they're reducing the projectile size by 75%, making it have the same projectile size as the Scorpion. Just kidding, smaller than the Scorpion, the Spike. This makes the Astraeus actually kind of have a purpose, dragging it actually out of D tier. When the change comes through, the Astraeus goes to C tier. And the reason why is because even though it's not going to be ultra meta, you can play with that and make that work. Now you're going to be able to actually land your shots deep into your opponent's build and actually hit things that explode. That's the weakness of the Astraeus. You're basically throwing telephone poles at them, but now you'll be throwing needles at them, allowing you to hit them deep in their builds in the future. But that's still going to be you building around the Astraeus' terrible-ass perk, which hurts you just for that bonus damage, which is very interesting. Next up, we're going to cover the DT Cobra, only because of the fact it's just another drone. DT Cobra, we're just going to throw it down here into D tier because it's just a turret. It's low-tier turret play. It's not exceptionally effective in its power scores that can be used in. People can overwhelm them. They're just not very good. Next up is the Sinus O. Yes, we're saving the Varan for last because I need to think about that for a second. We're going to go over the Sinus O. Sinus O is a phenomenal machine gun. My goodness. Just about every power score that you drag the Sinus O into, it is a true threat. It's just annoying. It is better than the Vector by far. On hovers, it is ultra lethal. It's just remarkably brutal. At 4K hover power score, this thing can slap. When dragged up, it can slap. Any power score you see Sinus O's, they're doing their job. You can see them on the tops of Novas. You can see them basically any hover that gets a hold of Sinus O's. You got freaking problems. Its perk is iterative damage, does more damage. It's the same perk that is on the Spectre 2, but the problem is with the Spectre 2 is the power score is higher. Sinus O's only take 3 energy, the Spectre 2s take 4. Sinus O's have a slightly lesser perk, but they also have lower power score to compensate. So Sinus O, strong gun. Next up is the Varan. This thing was released in the recent patch, and by the way, the final weapon on the list, so I'm eager to get this done. Final weapon on the list was released in one of the more recent packs. It's another crossbow. It's difficult to rank. A lot of people want to like it. A lot of people, like myself, don't want to rank it, don't want to like it. It has small projectile size. It's basically not a machine gun crossbow, but a rapid fire crossbow. People have fused it for projectile speed. Some people say that there's entire clans running it in CW. It's like literally 4-man Varan builds. I've never seen that, and that doesn't sound like doesn't sound like it works. So ultimately, it's effective, but is it as effective as the effective weapons? Or is it something you have to build toward? It feels like it's a sniper weapon, and it feels like it can be effective on even cars. It can be effective on standard hovers. It's not a super weapon by any means, but it's not a bad gun. It's not like completely worthless, but it's definitely no super weapon. So we're going to put that at B tier because of the fact that you don't need to necessarily build in a very specific way or play in a very specific way for the variant. It is a negative press weapon, but it doesn't matter. It's very forgiving. It's the most forgiving crossbow because you can keep shooting. So there you go. It's a weapon that can strip, and so on and so forth. That's it. There we have it. The tier list. Done. S tier A, B, C, D. All weapons ranked. There you have it. This is what you guys have been asking for. I've been talking for hours. Nobody's going to watch this entire video, but if you do, I thank you for staying so long. I hope you agree with me. If you don't agree with me, let me know in the comments down below and say, no, this weapon over here is the best weapon. You're wrong, Cardboard Ninja. You don't know what you're talking about, yada, yada, yada. But this is how I see it. This is what you guys wanted to see. So we're both seeing what we want. All right. Peace.